right, hello everybody, and welcome to episode 12 of the On the Couch podcast, where we talk about Couchform and all of the formative ideas behind it, and all of the intentions behind all the fun principles within. And today, we'll be talking about a interesting one that mentions a lot about the time expectations of VR roleplay, what that generally looks like, and what kind of structures and expectations change how people interact with roleplays, and whether or not it helps people get involved or hinders it. But before we get into that, let's do some introductions.
All right. Hi, I am Silent. Done VR roleplay stuff for a little over 3 years now. I guess I kind of have enjoyed participating and running roleplay so much that now we're here and kind of discussing roleplay theory. It's my favorite pastime is theorizing about roleplay rather than participating, though I do occasionally participate.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's mostly what I do. I'm also a fan of improv, which I guess is a little bit related. Probably very. Actually, I should say it's very related. How about that? It's very related.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's me.
All right. And I'm Solus. I'm the guy that just realized a few days ago that there's a podcast category on Twitch, and now we're finally streaming to that. Not
Wow,
me just
just in
streaming
time.
to the just chatting
Just
category this entire time.
just in time. Just in time.
Yes, just in time for our literal last episode. Um, yes, been role playing for 4+ years. Also, like Silent here, been doing some theorizing lately, and I think finally getting back into roleplay. I've been working on my own project, but if I'm gonna be honest with you all, I'm actually thinking of sunsetting it because the design work I was a little too ambitious with. If I am going to create a roleplay, maybe I should start with something a bit simpler so I can actually get the hang of it and get into the rhythm, because not being in the rhythm and then trying to be in the rhythm is a lack of inertia, and that is hard for me lately. So getting back into roleplay is a good kind of first step, and I have been doing that. So fun times.
Mm-hmm.
So that being said, let's get into the topic of today, shall we? So
Yep.
extra credit, right? So we've talked a lot about some core fundamental structural principles before. We talked about design. We've talked about kind of structuring off of themes and such. This one's a bit different, but it also ties in with some of the discussions that we've had around the intro to Couchform and even safety. Because when we talk about extra credit and what the importance behind it is, we're talking about the expectations of how much people will be involved in a role play and how reasonable it is for a person to be adequately involved to enjoy it to the extent that you want them to. And without considering this, it is unfortunately very easy for a role play to kind of get off the rails, so to speak, and have enough opportunities for people to involve themselves if they don't have any other life priorities, way more than anyone else that might, for example, have a full-time job or something. And so without considering this getting out of hand means that it's very hard for people to be involved in the way that they want to, which makes it difficult to get involved in general and makes it unreasonable for those people. And we intrinsically tie that with the reasonable expectations category of essentials that we determine are necessary for a roleplay to function properly.
You know, I don't actually think, maybe we should update the document. Looking back at it, I don't think we actually have reasonable expectations in the discussion. But I suppose we do have safety and clear communication, right? Like we,
Hmm.
we do have that there, and I do think like this does kind of overlap with both of those topics, right? Like clear communication, because I think reasonable expectations are part of communicating clearly, right? Like you want your participants and your staff and everybody involved with the roleplay project to have an idea, clear idea of what's going to be happening within that that project. And we've talked a little bit about safety during these podcasts, right? We talked a little bit about safety. It's mostly been sort of like kind of like mental and emotional safety, but I think like we'll touch for the first time, I think, a little bit on like physical safety today
Hmm.
in the form of, overwork and exhaustion. Um, but yeah, I suppose we should probably define extra credit before continuing though.
Yes, yes, yes,
Like
yes.
define.
Yeah. So to set it in stone, extra credit is basically anything that is unexpected roleplay involvement that has not been communicated as part of the effective contract of joining and taking part in the roleplay. So things like 24/7 text roleplay, supplemental social lobbies and missions, all of that that doesn't sit within the communicated, 4 or 5 hours a week or whatever, that's your extra credit.
Say I would say all of those examples are like potential extra credit. Potential meaning like if it hasn't been communicated that that's a thing, you know?
Right.
Um, it's kind of like has the potential to be extra credit. Really, anything that I think anything that we like end up complaining about today, because I think we'll be doing a little bit of complaining at least.
Mm-hmm.
Um, kind of comes with the asterisk of it's extra credit because it wasn't agreed upon ahead of time, right? Something is extra credit specifically because you know the expectations of the roleplay were communicated, and then like new expectations were added on after the fact. After everybody had already agreed to kind of what was going on,
Yeah.
and that's what makes something extra credit. So it's not like there are certain things and there are certain topics that are more likely to become extra credit than others. The 24/7 text roleplay example, we'll have words about that for sure. But it's not inherent to the thing, right? It's not like 24/7 text roleplay is like inherently extra credit. Um, it's extra credit because often these things aren't agreed upon ahead of time. That's why it's extra credit, right? Um, I've actually seen a LARP that had where the entire premise of it was that it was kind of like a 24/7 LARP, and I think that's crazy personally. Um, but at the very least, I would then know to avoid attending that, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I, as a person who absolutely does not want to attend, a 24/7, engagement, would know to avoid that role play because I wouldn't want to get involved in something like that, and therefore I don't consider that to be extra credit.
Right. It's because that's like we said, communicated at the start, right? Going into this experience that's going to be 24/7. And I do want to also clarify that just because it's communicated at some point doesn't mean it's not extra credit, right? If I start this role play with like the 4 hours a week on Saturdays or whatever, and then I suddenly decide like 10 weeks in that all right, we're gonna do Tuesday missions for 5 hours now, then that changes the expectation. That's not necessarily agreed upon by everyone that's in it, and maybe they can't do Tuesdays. They can't put in any more time than they already have, so therefore, you know, changes the evenness of the people that are already involved and how they can engage with it. Suddenly creates this disparity, right? So
Mhm.
that being out there. Let's talk about why we're talking about this, like from a very base point, right?
Yeah.
So time, just to put the word out there, time is a limited resource. We as role players are doing this. Most of us doing this as a hobby, some of us as a job, but we'll get into that later. That being a hobby space, we have to think about the amount of time that people have and how they can spend it, because it is a limited resource. You only have so many hours in the week, in a day, so on and so forth. And the activity itself, VR roleplay, is already a very time intensive activity, right? I mean, not only do we have our like usually weekly sessions uh, that we have to kind of prepare to get into and spend all the time within it, and then sometimes debrief afterward. That we also have to worry about model work. We have to worry about different elements of planning, depending on what kind of player or staff member that we are on that project. And it puts into perspective the fact that we already spend quite a bit of time, even if the involvement is like on paper just the 4 hours a week. That you're probably looking at something closer to like 6, 8, or even 10, depending on like what it is that you're actually doing in the middle. If you're working on your own model, you're probably putting in further hours on top of that based on whatever it is you want to do.
I mean, I don't know about you, Solus. I am like from my perspective, like 4 hours once a week is like I think that's a big commitment already,
Yeah.
right? Like even if it was just that, like that 4 hours once a week is already a pretty large commitment of time, right?
Yeah.
Especially if it's like, you know, ad infinitum and there's no like prospective end date. Then it's especially a very large commitment.
Yeah.
Um,
It is absolutely.
yeah,
I think
and
also uh, it is very important to consider that people may take part in multiple role plays, right? It's like, you'll have if you even think about just 4 hours a week for the one role play, imagine someone that's involved in two, three, or four, right? Now you're encroaching on the time involvement of like a part time job, at least,
mhm,
if not more. And that gets pretty crazy.
yeah. I mean, yeah, it gets a bit difficult there because, of course, if from the perspective of an organizer, right, like, you're not going to be able to like directly control how much time other people are putting into things, right? But we can do our best on our part. I will add an addendum because you were talking about time being a limited resource. I guess not to get too philosophical here, but like I would
Mm.
I would like raise that a little bit and like in my opinion like time is like the most important resource basically, right? Like pretty much everything that you do is going to cost a certain amount of time, and you're not getting that time back. I personally like whenever I'm doing something, I am very very aware of like not wasting other people's time. I really don't want to waste other people's time. That is something that I personally try to do because and I guess this is like a personal take, but I think it is like a very valuable thing that you should be thinking about, right? Because like if you are essentially like taking other people's time and they're not getting um they're not getting much out of that time, that's pretty. I think that's a pretty bad outcome.
Yeah. I think I see it a little bit differently. I absolutely see your angle. I would kind of reform that just a little bit, in that my understanding of it is we have the time, time moves in a certain way for us. We're already going to spend it doing something. And the importance of that something then becomes A, what kind of energy that we're actually expending for it, and B, what the return on that is, right? And a lot of this can either speak to the value of the time that we're spending or like how much we're getting back from it, right? So that's totally like I think both thoughts, but both kind of philosophical thoughts on
Yeah.
time definitely work here, right?
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah. Regardless, time is limited, and like
Yeah.
you're not getting it back. Um, and we should be aware of that, right? We should be aware of that both as designers of role plays and also as players. Be aware not just of your own time, but also other players and you know the organizers, right? You should be aware of everybody's time.
Hmm. Absolutely. And so let's move forward a bit. Let's talk about what that actually means. So we have a bold text in the principle itself, which is kind of what this all centers around, which says very very forwardly that maximum involvement is the expectation of the role play. Right. So what this means is, uh, well, I guess the vice versa is that anyone who is involved less than the maximum is literally missing out on something that they could be doing, which is we're kind of combating the fight against FOMO here. I don't think FOMO is certainly a thing in and of itself, but when we're talking about maximum involvement, what we're looking at is how much people can engage with the content of the roleplay. If someone can do more, then we should assume that they will. This is very similar to our considerations with safety, right? When we were talking about safety in episode 3, we looked at the kind of boundaries and like how far the intensity of a role play and how far that could go. And what we surmise there is that the intensity of the role play is set by the person with the most flexible boundaries, because that person is going to be able to explore the most. They're going to push to explore to their limits, and that effectively sets the pace for everyone else to kind of follow. And that might make some issues with like comfort and etc. This is kind of a similar consideration where if we allow, as creators of these projects, the space for people to roleplay in a certain way, we should assume that there will be at least one person who will do everything that they can, which means they're going to be doing more than others, which means the others are very literally missing out on those opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You talked about FOMO. I will say I, I think that is somewhat of a common term, but I'll spell it out. Fear of missing out, I suppose, is like a topic, and I I'm actually going to want to talk about that in two different contexts. So like once here and then once later.
Sure.
Um, we can talk, I think, a little bit about fear of missing out. I do think this kind of comes up around like role play, in the sense of like there does tend to be a sort of fear of missing out, which kind of makes players nervous, like if they're not getting the maximum involvement out of their role play, right? It's like, oh, a thing is happening, I need to be there. And I think there is a sort of like a player responsibility to be set of like, if you are not in a position, right? If you are attending a role play and you're not in the position to, attend, right? Like you do need to at some point take responsibility for yourself and make peace that, you might miss out on something, right? It's okay. You can calm down. That is not, however, an excuse, right? That's not an excuse on the organizer end to not be concerned at all about your player's time, right? That is not an excuse. Um, so yes, on one hand, role play is, we're playing. It's a game. It's okay if not everybody is there for every single session. It's fine, right? It's not the end of the world. On the other hand, we were just talking about time and how important it is. It's not an excuse to create an environment in which people are essentially guaranteed to miss out, right? Even if they're kind of making informed decisions.
Mm.
Um, right? Even if they're kind of like they've made the informed decision to be like, okay, well, actually, I can attend this role play in full, and then later they find out that, well, oh, well, actually, there are these three other things that have come up, right? That is still not, no amount of personal responsibility, right? Um, like basically both of these things need to be present, right? Both the personal responsibility on behalf of the player to kind of make intelligent choices on their own time, and also uh, the responsibility on behalf of organizers and also other players to not create an environment in which you're going to be making other people miss out on things um, that you didn't tell them about beforehand.
Yeah. Another way to think about that is creating an environment where it is reasonable to be involved in uh, the roleplay at a full capacity, right? If you think about what it takes to be maximally involved in a roleplay, and you find that it is too much for the average person, then you should reconsider what those involvements are and whether those are even necessary to participate.
Waffle has a comment here. It's a rather amusing one. It
Mm-hmm.
says, "I liken it to being like playing an RPG with some friends, only to get to session 3 and realizing that some of your friends have been playing without you and have gotten further than you are in the story."
Yep.
And yeah, I mean, I do think that kind of summarizes it. That's kind of like that's basically the feeling, right? Of like, yeah,
Yeah, this is like whenever. So I have levied this consideration to a lot of people, and sometimes I do get the pushback of like people should manage their FOMO better, and saying basically it's not a big deal that other people are playing in certain things and not others, and not able to participate in full. And then I combat that with, or I guess I juxtapose that with the experience of having gone into a session that is like the communicated weekly session, etc., and doing your thing, kind of progressing and building some of these bonds with some other characters, and feeling like you got out of there pretty good, and then going back only to realize that that other character that you wanted to kind of further a story with has already spent a lot of time in between bonding with other characters and has effectively gravitated toward them, right?
yeah,
There's absolutely some level of like feeling cheated of the experience that you don't really have the option to change how other people kind of experience it if they can in between put in the extra like 15, 20 hours to enjoy the roleplay more than you. And it realistically is it, right? Like the more time you get to roleplay, the more time you get to develop these sort of like trust between characters and to experience the story more, and thus you're effectively quote unquote further ahead, right? There's no like linearity in roleplay, but it should be very easily understood that the more time you spend in a roleplay, the more fulfilled you are as a role player.
mhm,
Waffle says people need to
yeah,
manage their FOMO better, but organizers need to manage their time monopolization better too. Absolutely.
yeah. I don't even necessarily think. I've absolutely yeah. I guess there are two aspects of it, right? Sometimes organizers ask a lot of their participants, um, and then like ramp up the expectations over time. Honestly, I think asking a lot of your participants is not extra credit, right? Ramping up the expectations over time is extra credit. Um, and I think there's also the when organizers kind of like leave the door open and you don't set a maximum, right? This is the maximum involvement is the expectation in your role play. Um, if no maximum is set, right, by the organizers, then your players are going to set that maximum for you. And being in VR roleplay, we're in an online space. Some people, some people in this space have like, you know, 9 to 5 job. They're coming home from work and like getting on to roleplay. Some people are not getting home from work because they live in Europe and it's actually like 4 in the morning for them, right? Um, Other people, other people might not have a job and they have all the free time in the world, and even yet other people, their job might be literally to roleplay, right? And so it is in that person's interest to roleplay a lot. So we do have like a mix of people, and Solus, you've already brought it up, but just like with safety, we're talking about how the person who has kind of who's the who's the kind of like the loosest safety needs, who's the most comfortable, who's the has the most flexible boundaries, will set the boundaries for the space, and therefore you kind of that person or those people kind of need to be responsible and kind of limit themselves a bit more. In that same way, uh, those participants and those organizers who have the most time kind of need to be cognizant that you're in a position that not many other people are, right? And you might be able to do um, 8 hours 3 times a week perfectly fine, right? But that's not a position that I think even a tenth of the the tenth of the population can do in a healthy manner, right? That's a bit of an exaggeration. That's an extreme rather, not so much of an exaggeration. We'll get to that. Um, but yeah, so essentially, for the people who have a lot of time to put into role play, right? If no maximum is being set, likely the people who have a lot of time will set that maximum way higher than the vast majority of people in the role play will be able to keep up with.
Mhm.
Way higher.
The
And
assumption. Sorry, go on.
and I suppose to wrap it up, and this will inevitably, just like with safety, right? Just like with safety stuff was leading to the alienation of those people who have kind of boundaries, which is a good thing. I think it's really good to have boundaries. But those people who are the most vulnerable are going to be alienated. In this case, it's kind of like the same thing. Those people with the least time, the least free time, are just going to be alienated from your space.
Yeah. The assumption that is best to make when the boundaries are not clearly set out by the organizers is that the most time possible will be spent. So if you do have your supplemental 24/7 open roleplay, text roleplay, you expect that to be used 24/7 because that is the maximum that could be used. Similarly, if you have only a soft end on your roleplay, you assume that will continue forever until a person would reasonably be awake for too long and go to bed, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's another topic to get into, soft end.
I have a personal anecdote here. Speaking of the going on forever.
Go for it.
Um, yeah, this is gang roleplay. This was possibly the most negative experience that I had in the entirety of that roleplay. Um, we did not. We were allowed as players in gang roleplay. Gang roleplay was part of kind of metaverse roleplay, meaning that like the metaverse is a shared setting that kind of just goes on. People host their own lobbies and the thing. And at the beginning of the roleplay, we had essentially gang roleplay was once a week. Then later, right, we had a bit of the staff escalation where then it became you had a session one day and then you had a session on Tuesday and then the mission on Friday. Or maybe it was the other way around. I don't remember. Um, right, but then it escalated to 2 sessions a week, right? That was I guess part of that staff escalation. Then later, This escalated to missions at random times during the week whenever staff felt like it. That was pretty bad. But
Ooh.
also, in addition to this sort of like staff escalating the involvement, at some point, I specifically remember the first like in character party was held at around like Thanksgiving one year. We had like a in character party, and people enjoyed that party so much that we kind of asked staff, hey, can we like host our own sessions like this in the future? And roleplay staff said yes. And in the following like 2 months, the participation from the players kind of like ramped up. Um, like by this was November, right? Thanksgiving was in November. By the time we got to January, I think gang roleplay was averaging 5 sessions a week. And 5 sessions, some of them, I don't think I think session here, none of them lasted less than 4 hours, right? Some of them lasted upwards to like 8 or 9 hours. Um, and it was just people starting lobbies and being there. Now, I don't think anyone was present at all the sessions, right? Because we did have two separate gangs that thankfully stopped people, like literally stopped people like in character from being at all the sessions, right? But it doesn't matter, right? There was like on average, I think like 5 sessions of role play per week. Like minimum 4 hours, I would say, like per session, because people would start the lobby, and by the time people like left the lobby, like not everybody would stay the whole time, but by the time people had left the lobby, um, it would have been at least 4 hours. And that's not to mention the all the personal scenes that people were having in between characters. Like lots of people would schedule scenes with specific other players. Um, and that's still not to mention the 24/7 text role play that we had. Um, this became a really big problem. And thankfully, the staff kind of cut down on it. I think they cut down on it for the wrong reason. They didn't cut down on it because of concerns for people's health. They cut down on it because at some point the staff had literally no idea what was going on in their own roleplay, and it honestly wasn't directly their fault, because there's no way anybody could keep track of what was going on in that roleplay, because we were having 5 sessions a week. Um, so at some point it became too big for the staff to manage, and at that point they were like, okay, we're not doing this anymore. Stop it, cut it out. Um, and we kind of dropped back down to like 1 to 2 sessions a week. Um, there was still no hard end, and we still had the 24/7 text role play, but at least it wasn't 5 sessions a week. So yeah, that was possibly like the most negative experience that I had. It was really terrible. Like, you would wake up in the morning and you would check the roleplay chat, and you would see like 1,000 messages from like the night before, like while you were sleeping. Or like people would message you at like 4 a.m. with like, oh shoot, something's going down right now. We need you in a scene, right? Um, yeah, that it was just absolutely not healthy. And that's like, this is, I suppose, potentially like the most extreme, or like close to the most extreme that you could possibly get with extra credit, right? I had a very, very bad experience, and this has kind of like radicalized me in this sense. And we're basically, I am never doing that again. That's my experience.
I think my radicalization toward this was with Fractured Thrones, where we actually did start out with just the Tuesday sessions. And this is me now harkening back to like when the song Tuesday was made by Lone Complex. Like that was like that's the day of the week, right? This is where we get to look forward to the role play. It's gonna be fun. It's great. We have the one time a week. Everyone's high energy. It's awesome. And then they added Thursdays. And then at some point we were like, cool, we get another roleplay day. It's a bit heavy, but like we're all into this. And then at some point, like Wednesdays were just kind of de facto made into a mission day, and suddenly these missions started happening every week, and that meant now we're doing 3 days of roleplay a week that don't have hard ends because there was never a hard end in Fracture Throne. So it was always like something was going on all the way until like 7, 8 hours in, and that made people burn out so fast because everyone was trying to go to all those sessions, and it was unfortunately the FOMO in that space was very large because there's always something important happening in those. There's no episode that is less important than any other, and thus with everyone getting involved in everything, everyone started to call for hard ends and for less days to roleplay. And I think that only ended up happening in season 3. Although by minimizing down to Tuesday, Thursday, with Thursday being the optional mission day, they also added some Saturdays, which once again brings it back to the 3 a week. And I'm not sure what's going on with that now. I do hope that time has been cut down more. But that experience of having ramped up from the 1 to 2 and then 3 of like potentially 6 to 8 hour sessions has certainly pushed me toward the understanding of, yeah, I understand now why it's not necessarily great to allow these super long sessions multiple times a week when we came in with the understanding that we're just going to do 4 or 5 once a week. Very, very, very different. 4 to 5 hours a week is very different from supposedly 18 plus in 3 consecutive days. That absolutely killed my energy at work because I've worked full time ever since I got involved in roleplay. So my energy had been absolutely monopolized outside of work, and it drained me so much, made it very hard to focus.
Yeah, gosh. I would like I obviously don't know anything about how it was like in Fracture Thrones, but I would liken my experience in gang roleplay to essentially being on call because I did mention 5 days a
Mm-hmm.
week as a number. I didn't like mention weekdays because we didn't have set days of the week. It was just whenever somebody called for a session, um, or whenever somebody asked you to like attend the scene, or like whenever something was happening, right? And I would liken that experience to like being on call. And I don't know. With the topic, with the topic of burnout, I would suggest maybe like a slight deviation from our schedule here. We have like this topic here.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Um, so I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, right? Like previously in kind of like previously when we talked about safety in VR roleplay, right? We've talked a lot about safety and trust and all that sort of thing. Um, but we haven't really talked about physical safety, right? We haven't really talked too much about physical safety in the VR space. And part of that is because, VR roleplay is, in a sense, kind of, there is both, it's in a sense kind of like more physically safe, but also in a sense, as an organizer, like speaking from an organizer's perspective, you also have less kind of agency over people's physical safety, right? Um, if you compare this to like an IRL sort of LARP roleplay experience, right? Like in an IRL LARP, the organizers are going to have to be like on top of physical safety, right? Like you're going to have to check your like venue to see if it's like if it's like safe, if it's accessible to people with disabilities. You're going to have to think about like food and allergies. If you're doing like boffer combat, you're going to have to check everybody's like weapons, make sure they're like the swords are like properly soft foam, like kind of like go over there's just so much. It honestly seems like a nightmare. And in comparison, in VR, you plop on a headset in the comfort of your own home. um the 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 most usually the most physical danger that we think about is like somebody punching their wall and hurting themselves that way. And we do, to kind of to the credit of people, we do kind of like tell people check your play space, make sure it's clear so you don't trip over anything. But I think part of the reason this doesn't really get talked about more than it does is because when we're in VR, right, we're not there with the other person. You can't actually like check to make sure that somebody is taking, physical safety precautions on their own end, right? Like in their own play space. You can't actually check or force somebody to do those things. Um, which when somebody does get hurt, I think it can be like very like when somebody does get hurt. I've been in that situation previously. It can be kind of it very much feels like there's nothing you can do as like from an organizer perspective. Um, but today's topic is something that we very much can do something about and is also, very visible. Because I wanted to talk a bit about like physical exhaustion, right? And that's a thing that I think needs to be talked about a bit more, right? Like physical exhaustion is a sort of physical safety concern that we absolutely can do stuff about. So yeah, I guess let's talk about that a bit.
Yeah. And I will kind of push on just a small point in that it is like very visible. It's kind of not, right? Like being physically exhausted just sneaks up on you until it's like seriously a problem.
Oh yeah, no, sorry.
Right.
Absolutely not visible, but it is
Yeah.
something that we can plan around, right? We can't force somebody to clear their play space, but we can, limit the amount of time people are in role play.
Right. And it's like I
Go
guess
ahead.
having kind of experienced this myself and being in a current state where like I am effectively my sleep schedule is like completely broken and I am most times, if not all times, way more tired than I usually would be. I still have not gone to a doctor about this and I really should. But I am at least very very understanding of the fact that this has resulted from the amount of time and stress that has been directly related to roleplay, whether being involved in it or tangentially things that I'd have to focus on or worry about with it. Um, Waffle is actually saying something that I was about to say, so that's good. I'm going to read this comment. Um, so Waffle says, oh, first of all, Waffle talks about heat exhaustion and stroke being included here. Also very important if you're in an environment that's not very easily temperature controlled or you have a very hot headset. That can be a problem, especially if you're not hydrating, and that connects to the next point that Waffle makes. And I will get to the era 2 as well, Waffle. I think those are both previously the ones you talked about, 0.5 episodes. All good points. I'll get to those in a bit. But there is a Waffle says there's definitely a weird disconnect from actual body state when VR that they've noticed. Like when they've role played for a 6 hour session and still feel capable of continuing while they have the headset on, but the moment they take it off, straight up fatigue wall. That is totally true. There is, I think basically anyone who has been using VR for long enough can kind of attest to this. There's a sort of like removal from the physical needs of your body when you get into VR that you can end up getting hungry, needing to drink water or needing to get tired normally, and VR will basically just remove all that, right? Like VR will just like put you in this different like neutral state of mind and physical being. And yeah, when you get out, it just kind of all hits all at the same time, right? You're feeling like
Yeah.
kind of weird and grimy from all of the like, you know, whatever oils and sweat has accumulated on the headset, and it's like, wow, that sucks. And then you start to
Yeah,
realize
putting the
I've been
headset
having
back on Right, I've explicitly had this experience of like putting the headset back on and just like suddenly realizing, wow, this is really sweaty. It's kind of gross.
Yeah,
I didn't notice this until I took it off and was about to put it back on. Um, you know.
yeah. But like, yeah, there's definitely a removal from the physical needs, which is why like I generally advise people not to take super long sessions, though I tend to do that unfortunately, or at least understand when you can, because like if you effectively skip your dinner to get on and then you end up on for 6 hours and you don't feel hungry, there's a reason for that. I'm sure there's some like psychological study that talks about this because I think it is something that could be very well understood. But this is a very common effect that a lot of people can attest to, right? So this does once again incentivize us and encourage us more to take care of ourselves as much as we can before putting that headset on and recognize that like we're not going to feel as many of the bodily needs when we're in VR as we would otherwise. So we need to like be aware of that.
Hmm.
Ever wear a pair of nitrile
Yeah.
gloves for a while and then take them off? Yeah, exactly. Like you never know until you take them off and you just feel like it feels like a weird like surface coat of sweat. It's fucking awful.
Hmm. I would say like, man, I also like, I've explicitly like have attempted to. It's very hard as somebody who lives in the United States, but I've like explicitly attempted to run some like specifically European time zone like oriented events because I feel really bad for anybody in Europe who like tries to roleplay in this community. It's just like probably awful, like incredibly awful.
Yep.
I can only imagine. But really, if like I think about it a lot, I don't think the sort of time requirements that are kind of common in this community, I don't think they work for any time zone in reality, right? Like, um, it is probably the worst for Europe, but I don't think it's quite healthy for anybody, just with the massive like session lengths, like
Yeah.
where like if your role play starts at like 8 p.m. and still lasts until 4 a.m., that's still kind of, you know,
Yeah.
um I think some of these role plays are just like not healthy or they're not convenient for anybody really. Um that's been kind of my experience. Not all of them, but definitely a large number.
I've uh I've had a conversation earlier today about like the sweet spot of amount of time in a role play. And the answer that I got was somewhere in the 4 to 5 hour timeline, and then hard ending at 5 hours. And I think that actually feels about right to me. 5 hours being like kind of the upper end, mostly because like you have, and this is the way they explain it too. You have kind of the ramp up period where it takes a while to really get into the headspace of the character, really enter that magic circle. You have maybe a couple hours of like very core narrative elements and plots, like things that are like organized that happen within the session. You might have like the latter end being these like kind of planned events. Maybe you had like the need to talk to a certain character to like get something out of the way or to experience some particular scenes, and then like that covers most of your like 3 to 4 hours to begin with, and then you have kind of the soft last bit, like a half hour to an hour, where you have these sort of like
Mm-hmm.
emotional evening scenes and these wind downs and these like kind of last elements of the day before actually the hard end happens and the role play definitely ends. And that's something that we absolutely advocate for is
Mm-hmm.
within this principle, the hard end is mandatory. You need the role play
Mm-hmm.
to end at a particular time after having started it, so that you can bring everyone together to debrief, so that you can manage the amount of time that people spend within the role play. Many different reasons, but those two I think are vastly important enough to make it essentially mandatory.
Hmm. Yeah, I think gosh, I would probably agree with like 5 hours being like an absolute maximum. Um, Even that feels like really long to me, right? That already
Mm-hmm.
feels really long, especially if you want to like incorporate sort of like debrief in. Um, I know like from my like personal like level of role play, I usually start getting tired and like feel the need to sit down after around 3 hours. Um, that's where I usually like start getting tired, and going further than that is like pushing. And five hours is like almost double than that. So like I personally would want to.
Mm-hmm.
I personally wouldn't want to avoid. I would want to avoid role playing for that long already. But yeah, it's like I would agree that like 5 hours is probably like I feel like that's the maximum that you could reasonably do for like a weekly role play um at once. I think it's we haven't really done experimentation with other formats. I've like really wondered what a sort of like weekend LARP would look like in VR chat. I think if you had something that doesn't go on forever, right? It's like not weekly, it doesn't go on forever. It's just like one weekend. You could potentially do more in one day if you also incorporated like a dedicated break in the middle. Maybe, maybe that's not a good idea. I don't know, but
It'd be
yeah,
interesting.
I don't know. Yeah, it's just not something that has been explored,
Yeah,
um, really. So
we do love our
yeah,
campaign style role plays in this space.
food for thought. But yeah, I don't know. Like I am very much in the sort of like 3 to 4 hour camp.
Mm-hmm.
I think 4 to 5 hours still fine. I'd be willing, but any more than that, it's like you are really pushing people at that point, right? Like
Yeah.
just think about like in a day how long you go about like standing, like because that's like at that point, right? Like you'll need like excuses in character to sit down and rest. Because in VR, unlike in real life, you can't really rest and roleplay at the same time, right? IRL LARPs, I think, can get away with going a bit longer because you can eat, sleep, and rest in a character, right? Theoretically, if
Mm-hmm.
the roleplay is designed that way. Um, so in a real life scenario, you can absolutely get away with going longer because you can rest in character. Um, I don't really think you can rest in VR. At least you can't fully rest. I know there are probably people who are like, okay, I can like eat while in VR, or like I can do. It's not, it's not the same, right? It really isn't. You're like maybe like half resting, kind of, sorta, you know, and you still have the brick on your head if you're not taking the headset off. It's still that extra weight on your neck, which is like a serious thing. Like
Mm-hmm.
having that extra weight on your neck if you're like don't have the proper posture is like that. That's a serious consideration. Um, yeah, basically, I would just go out and say you can't really rest. You can't truly rest while you are in VR. Um, Certainly not while you're in roleplay. Um, and so it's kind of and yeah, so that's kind of one of the current like weaknesses of the medium, and we just need to be aware of that and work around it.
And I guess this is something that like evolves with the technology, right? Because now we have the big screen beyond. Like most of the headsets we have nowadays, we can't bring a like glass, like a pint glass up to our face because the upper end would hit like the nose bridge. But big screen beyond is a bit higher up, so you can actually do that. So it is easier to consume beverages while in VR if you got like your I don't know, your apple juice or whatever, just sitting there in a glass like I do from time to time, then I can actually partake in that without taking my headset off, and that makes it a little bit easier. So it's like there's definitely something to be said about like as the technology evolves, it becomes a little bit easier to take care of ourselves. And
Might get better in the future. Yeah.
yeah, and with the support on our heads, like the weight being felt less, it definitely helps with like the neck strain problem. But that is still very much an issue. That again, we are wearing these bricks on our heads, and the longer we wear them, the more our necks are straining to keep them on. And again, that's something we don't feel over time. We don't feel that being a problem. But then if we start feeling like, some pull in our neck and that's starting to like actually affect our health, and then by then it's too late, you know? So
Hmm.
we want to like try to take care of ourselves in those sort of circumstances. We want to try to minimize the amount of super long sessions that we're having when that we are straining to hold this thing up.
Hmm. That's actually a pretty good point about the technology, right? Like, I think it will definitely get better over time. Off the top of my head, this is not something I thought about any like in depth because this is the first time thinking about it. Off the top of my head, it still doesn't feel like a problem that's going to completely go away, if for no other reason, right? Like your ability to prepare food to eat, right? Like that seems like it would probably be quite hard to do, while in a role play, in a virtual space in a role play to also prepare food IRL. I feel like that's going to, regardless of what technology you have, like unless we have like, I don't know, like automatic food preparation, like I don't know, your kitchen makes your food for you, right? Like uh maybe then, but until we're living in the sci-fi fantasy future, it feels like we're probably going to have to live with breaks for our VR role play.
Get you a
Um,
partner that'll just spoon feed you during roleplay.
just set up your VR, and the Waffle says, yeah, just set up your VR in your kitchen. The linoleum is good on the bones. Well,
Hell yeah.
honestly, like, even then, like even if your VR setup is in the kitchen, right? Like, how are you gonna role play, right? I don't know. Like, I'm like, I have like people shooting like the space aliens around me, and I'm just there like preparing a soup or something. Like, it seems kind
He
of
can
silly.
leave the soup on the stove. Just let it sit there, kind of heat up while you're also shooting the space aliens and trying not to hit your kitchen island.
Yeah. Uh yeah. Anyway, I feel like it's probably going to get better over time, but we're probably not getting away from this from the current length of session anytime soon. I feel like
Yeah.
it doesn't feel like that's a near future thing.
Yeah, definitely not. This will continue to be a problem. Uh, the one thing I would very much urge from this like point of conversation is that role plays start looking at implementing hard ends instead of just soft ends, because only having a soft end once again sets up that uh, unclear level of involvement, which again players will set that boundary for you suddenly, way too much time being spent, etc., etc. I think the major part of that session length is that said bodily need disconnect. People feel like they can keep going, so they keep going. Yep, exactly. If you don't feel like you're hungry, if you don't feel like you're tired, you're like, okay, I can keep going, no problem. And yeah, again, like VR does remove that like the sense of physical need. It just absolutely does. It's weird. I don't know why it happens, and I'm curious. I actually think I'm gonna probably search this up, see if there is some sort of like actual research article
Mhm.
on this to like, because this is definitely a very interesting space of
Mhm.
understanding of how our brains work, right? If we are in VR and our body's like, oh yeah, you're good, man. You don't need to go to the bathroom. You don't need to eat. You don't need to sleep. You're good.
I
Like,
think
there's a lot to comment on
I
there.
don't even I don't even know if this is strictly like a VR phenomenon because like I don't know, like I'll get stuck in like in interesting conversations from time to time and like, forget to eat or forget to go to sleep, right? It's kind of like I don't even know if it's strictly like a VR phenomenon, but I guess
Hmm.
it's definitely would be an interesting thing to look into.
Yeah.
I think it might be more of like just being immersed in something, you know, like putting your full concentration towards the thing, which I think, you know, is kind of the goal of role play. That's like my gut feeling, but it certainly is something to look more into.
Wonder if it's something to do with constant. I'm reading Waffle's comment here. I wonder if it's something to do with constant stimulus. Like if you're extremely busy all day at work, but not with hugely strenuous tasks, it's easy to miss lunch until it's near closing time. That's true too, right? When you get like really embedded in a task and your brain is kind of working on all cylinders for it, then you look at the time and it's like, oh wow, 5 hours have passed. I get this way with model
Yeah.
work quite often, where I'll be working on this model and I'll kind of like hop from thing to thing and I'll get in a good rhythm. And I might have started at like, I don't know, 9, 10 p.m. And then look at the clock. And I'm like, oh shit, it's 3 in the morning. How did this happen? Oh, that's very,
Yeah.
I do wonder if it's like also related to the like getting your VR leg stage, that your brain has to like effectively reformat what it believes about what's around it, because like the whole process of getting involved in VR to begin with is your brain understanding what's VR and what's reality, so it has to separate the two. And I wonder if like there's a similar line of workings in the brain that if it thinks you're in virtual reality, does it just forget all of the things that are in reality? Like, all this is very interesting. Probably won't don't
Yeah.
want to spend too much time on it, but it's a very cool
Yeah,
area of thought.
absolutely. Roleplay is, I think, also like quite a mentally taxing, you know, thing. Like playing a character and also kind of like, you know, having that dual awareness, kind of like being aware of yourself as you're playing a character, right? Like, um, I think it is just quite like a mentally
Oh yeah,
taxing activity.
yeah, you're like put in two different ways pushing away from yourself effectively, right? Immersing yourself in a character and also like immersing yourself in a virtual environment. That's pretty wild. I hadn't thought about that.
Mm-hmm. So, soft end.
Yeah, don't do well. Do have soft ends as long as they're in conjunction with hard ends, because I will say the soft end is very useful for like I mean, you could speak on this as
Yeah.
having run a project yourself, but I can imagine.
I like soft ends, right? I like soft ends. I think the point that we're making here is it's a soft end itself, you know, I think it's kind of like a deceptive term, you know, you have end in the word, right? But a soft end is really, it's just soft. It's not an end, right? There is no end
Mhm.
when it's just a soft end.
Which just to define it a bit further, for the sake of the podcast here, is that when we think about soft end, we usually think, all right, so these like organized elements of the role play, like plot elements, things that GMs would normally oversee, big events, those end with the soft end. So anything after the soft end is generally usually kind of player focused or player driven, and it's a wind down for the usually the organizers to kind of sit there and think about all the things that have been run and how they've been run, and then like kind of observe how the wind down is happening.
Yeah. Um, in Worlds Apart, we kind of define soft end as like we have finished with any GM run plot. We are no longer instigating anything. In the final hour of roleplay, we are going to allow people to bring the things, right, bring the stuff that was instigated earlier to a close, right? And you have an hour to do so. Good luck.
Good luck.
Um, yeah. Try not to start new things also,
Yeah.
because in an hour from now, right, the sun has set. You have an hour to wind up. If you haven't, or sorry, you have an hour to wind down. If you haven't wound it down by that hour, too bad.
Yep.
You know, that's that was kind of the deal. You know, um, that was kind of the deal that we had. Um, now. I was I do remember being a little bit upset because soft end was, or rather, the hard end was not always respected.
Mm-hmm.
We did kind of have to go after people.
Yeah.
Uh,
I,
I think the only time that I was kind of okay with it was on literally the last episode. I was like, okay, fine, PP, go ahead, keep role playing, whatever. Right? It's the last session, you know. But on any other role play day, I was thoroughly upset when we called the hard end, and it's like 5 minutes to repeat, still people on role play. 10 minutes passed, people are still on role play. 15 minutes passed, and then we have to go and like kick people out of the map, right? And yeah, you know. Um,
I think you might
but yeah,
recall that I was actually the one that brought it up into the player chat because there were enough people. So my understanding was that hard end was basically the last call for the scene. So basically, no new scenes, and whatever scene you're in, and that's the end of the role play.
it was like stop right now. Like, okay, if you're gonna go like 5 minutes over, it's like okay, fine. But like,
Yeah.
we did have people going like 15 minutes over quite regularly. It
Yeah.
was
So
that yeah, I was kind of upset. But yeah, let's talk about this, right? Let's talk about, soft end
yeah.
specifically, right? Because this idea, hard end is okay. Role play ends right now. Whether or not it's being respected, that's a whole nother discussion. We can also get into that discussion in a moment, and I do actually want to get into that discussion. But soft end is like the wind down phase of the role play, right? GMs are no longer around, and I think this is like, in some like sense, soft end is hard end for the GMs, right? It's hard end for the staff, you know? Or I guess maybe not all staff, but specifically for the sort of floating around GMs, right? Um, and I don't know, like I think that's pretty good, right? It's pretty good for the for GMs to be like, okay, we're done. No more. We don't have to fly around and like try to keep track of like 40 different people anymore. Very, very taxing, by the way, to try and like keep. It's actually impossible to keep track of what 40 people are doing, but you do your best. And the constantly switching context, right? Constantly like jumping between different people and like keeping tabs, making sure everybody's doing okay, is a very exhausting task. So I think having that phase where the GMs are like, okay, we're done, is really good and really healthy, and I think akin to having a hard end for your roleplay. Um, but if you leave it at soft end, right? If you leave it at soft end and you allow your players to wind down, and you don't have a hard end, we were talking at the beginning of this podcast. The maximum involvement is the expectation, and if you don't set a maximum, you have to expect that some people will keep going until they basically pass out. That has to be the expectation then. And from personal experience and also like from seeing how long people go on in the role play, this absolutely does happen. Right?
Mm-hmm.
There are role plays that have soft end at 4 hours that regularly go on for 8 hours.
Yep.
Um, and you have to expect that, right? If you're only going to have to have a soft end, like, you have to expect that people are going to go until they're on the verge of collapsing, because I don't know, people are some people are crazy, and that's just what they're gonna do. um
Yeah, just assume your players are crazy. Honestly.
yeah, I mean, you're doing something you enjoy, right? Don't you want to keep doing the things you enjoy, right? I think it's like, a kind of, there is like a desire to keep going and doing something you enjoy, right? Even if it's might be a little bit unhealthy for you. um And yeah, so I think that that's generally what happens with soft ends. And I don't know if you have anything to say about that. I do have a topic suggestion here.
Um, I'm mostly in agreement. I think soft ends are nearly mandatory for the cadence of a roleplay to be structurally supported. So, like I said earlier, you have your kind of wind up period where you're spending like half an hour to an hour actually getting into the full mindset of the character, getting into the rhythm of the experience, and the understanding that something will happen, and you'll be ready to kind of react to it. Because I don't know if you all have kind of experienced this. So like if something big happens in like minute one of the roleplay, it's very disorienting because you haven't quite gone into the headspace yet. Like we could sit there and prepare all we want. It does take time, right? And that's the beginning. Uh, Kind of the middle is obviously kind of the meat of the experience, and then the end should be a wind down, right? We've all been in these sorts of experiences where, like, if you haven't wound down, like Neon Divide, to Neon Divide's credit, they had a hard end, but they had a very, very hard end where they would warn like 5 minutes in advance, and then when they ended the session after the 4 hours, they would teleport everyone to the spawn room. So you would have a lot of scenes that would end up cutting short because of that. And that's because, like, sometimes we lose track of time. Sometimes we're kind of in something that can't take reasonably 15 minutes because of a lot of other circumstances or issues. And then suddenly, that's not something you can really return to because that's it. That's the session. So now that kind of pushes the value of the soft end, right? If you had the soft end before then you wouldn't necessarily have all of these like big important things happening. You wouldn't necessarily need to worry about like finding the time to wind down because you've already kind of structurally have it. Sorry, my cat's yelling.
I kind of wish I had included the, the the meeting on me, so-called meeting on me button on the menu for Worlds Apart. I didn't end up doing it because I was like, we were approaching Worlds Apart from like an angle of trusting people to respect the rules. So that's why I guess like I was a bit kind of jaded when that didn't happen.
Yeah.
I was just a bit upset because that was like I was like, okay, oh, I'm not gonna have to waste development time on this, right? I can do other stuff. Um, right, like we had the single person teleports because that ended up being very useful. We had to get people in position all the time. But I figured that like, hey, when we can just have a bell and you just ring the bell and that lets everybody know that it's over. They'll respawn on their own volition. Um,
So
but
when
yeah, I guess on this topic, I do want to talk about that. Yeah,
I wanted to say kind of on top of that, to
go ahead.
harken back to when I brought it up in the context of warp is that when I actually brought it up to the players as an issue, that was because the players were not only not respecting the hard end very well, that they were carrying scenes on for really long, but they were also starting new scenes. And given the understanding that it was a hard end of scenes and that you weren't supposed to start anymore, seeing people walk up and then start talking to people, completely new scene out of nowhere, to me, I saw that and I was like, this is not okay because you're effectively disrespecting the fact that other people uh, have respected this structural rule to say we don't enter scenes here after the bell has rung. The bell has rung. The role play is over. We wrap up the conversation. We finish off the session. We go back into spawn, and then we start talking with each other as people. When I saw people entering scenes after that, I was like, "What are you doing? Do you not care? Like, what's going on here?"
Hmm. Yeah, I actually, and I do want to talk about specifically this topic, right? We've talked a lot, on this podcast about like kind of like the organizer perspective, kind of like the designer perspective. I do think designers here have lots of responsibilities with hard end. I want to take a moment to kind of address players as well. Kind of this is the shared responsibility, that we all have to look out for each other. Because there are some things specifically in relationship to, like, soft end, hard end, that sort of thing, and also having scenes with people, outside of role play times, right? Um, kind of, I wanted to talk a bit about kind of like the effects of that, right? Because in and of itself, it's like, you might ask yourself the question, or you might ask others the question of, like, hey, I just had one scene with somebody else, what's the harm in that? Or, oh, I went 15-20 minutes over the end hard end, what's the harm? What's the harm? And I do want to talk a bit about the harm here. And because there are multiple things, right? There are multiple points of harm, and it's not necessarily the right, because it's not necessarily the exhaustion, right? Because it's like, you're not forcing other people directly to continue being in the role play, right? It is like technically like, each person's individual choice if they want to go overtime, right? So why not just leave it up to each person's individual choice, and, like, allow people to do it? Because it's not going to be like, physical exhaustion, right? If somebody takes that upon their self, that's like potentially a thing that they could choose, even if it's bad for them, right? This is kind of like the individualistic argument, right? That I'm probably doing a very bad job of like expressing it, right? But I want to talk about what the harm is, right? What the harm is in being sort of individualistic here. I think I did an awful job at expressing the argument, so probably ignore that. That's pretty terrible. But yeah, what is the harm in allowing people to keep going after the end, after the soft end, or keep going outside of outside of scheduled roleplay hours to schedule their own scenes with other people? What is the potential harm?
Well, I think we've kind of gone over a lot of those points, right? And like, it creates the opportunities for exactly what we've referenced, is like what the effects are and how those like impact the roleplay. I think actually there is something else to kind of comment on here that kind of ties in quite a bit to all of this, is power, right? When we think
Mm-hmm.
about when we think about role plays, we generally have an idea of who's really involved and who has like the most pull as far as what the interacting with the role play looks like, either in or out of character. Uh, there are certainly people that kind of are are either more poised or better positioned, or just genuinely have a better personality set toward defining what that looks like, whether it is kind of heavy shipping culture, whether it is attending all of the missions, whether it is the kinds of plots that people end up involved with in the roleplay. There are so many things that could kind of change and affect this power dynamic. One of the things that very, very heavily affects it is how much people are involved. So the person that is the most involved in the roleplay is also the most equipped to affect that power dynamic. And therefore, it very often revolves around said people. So the harm in this case comes into play with the people who are pushing for that extra time effectively being given more power over other people within the roleplay. And power in and of itself is not like a harmful thing. Like, it's absolutely you're going to have uneven power dynamics no matter what, right? That's some people have more social capital, some people have better understandings of projects. Like this is just something that's going to happen no matter what. But what becomes potentially harmful about it is the fact that it's tied to the amount of time that people are spending and the amount of attention that people are spending on these projects. And again, time is a precious and extremely valuable resource to us as people. That the more we are kind of forced to spend on it to have any sort of sway in the community that we are effectively building around these projects. Because every project has a community around it, right? Uh, if you have very little power in this sort of scenario, it can kind of feel like you're being left out. It can feel like you aren't actually a part of the group. And that is certainly a reality for a number of people as well. So, again, many, many things kind of pushing that power dynamic around, but time should not be one of those. Should absolutely not.
Mm. Um, yeah, I definitely agree. I think I'll give like I'll add one more argument here that I think we haven't covered, because we've covered like physical safety, we've covered time. This is kind of like my personal kind of like understanding of the situation. This is probably a bit of like a collectivist argument here rather than an individualist one. Um, if you are that player kind of in that situation where you're the player who it's soft end, the role play has ended after 4 hours, you're going to keep going for another 4 hours, right? And make it, and you're going to have an 8 hour session while everybody else is having a 4 hour session, right? Or if you're the player who has multiple private scenes with other with other characters like throughout the week, while other people aren't role playing, right? The way I see it, right? Other people who have signed up, right? Other people have signed up for this role play and are there and are ready to contribute, right? They're ready to give their 100% to this role play. Right? And they're like, they read the thing. It's like it's going to be 4 hours a week, once a week. They're ready with their model. They're ready to go, right? They're ready to give their 100%. And what you are doing, right, as the player who goes on for 8 hours in the 4 hour role play, or goes, or has these private private scenes, is you're turning other people's 100%. You're essentially diluting other people's 100%, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're essentially having 2 or even more sessions in the time that other people are having one session. And that's kind of like diluting their time. So they thought that they were here and ready to put in 100%, but they're actually not putting in 100% anymore. Now they're only putting in like 50% or even less. And the kind of the way I see it, like from their perspective, they either need to be, right? They signed up for a role play where they were ready to give their 100%, and now they're being put into a situation where you either need to be okay with missing out, right, on a substantial part of the role play, or they need to push themselves further than they were willing to when they signed up. Right? Now that's kind of the dilemma that you put everybody else in this role play into, is you either need to be okay with missing out on stuff that you weren't even told was going to happen. You're missing out on the experience, right? Having your experience diluted, or push yourself further and harder than you were ready to do so when you signed up. And I don't know, like I think that's just very unfair. That's just like a very unfair situation to put other people in. And I think like I personally think that in any role play that does have like does say 4 hours once a week, and you go and start doing other scenes, I think that's incredibly unfair. And if you're doing that, then you are putting other people in this position. And also the staff is also responsible here, right? The staff is responsible for allowing you to put other people into that position, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I do think there is like that personal responsibility of you are essentially taking other people's, time and you're making it less. You're making their experience be less than what it could have been.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, I mean that's kind of the way I see it. That is what I think the harm is in from the player end of doing more than the roleplay like explicitly allows for. Is you're basically saying to everybody else that your experience is less than mine, unless unless you also push yourself harder than you're able to or willing to. And yeah, I don't know. That might be an overly I'm certain nobody actually thinks about it in that way, right? I'm certain nobody's actually like, nobody actually does this like, wants to diminish other people's experiences.
Mm-hmm.
But you kind of are, and I encourage you to think about it in that way because you kind of are. There is something to be said about fear of missing out, but in this case, you are literally actually causing people to miss out, right?
Yep.
Miss out on things that they weren't supposed to. They weren't supposed to miss out, and they were ready to not miss out on. So, in this case, I think that fear is very rational. I think it's incredibly rational. I think it's incredibly unfair.
Mm-hmm. It's the understanding of by doing something more than the allotted time, you are effectively creating a space where this is now part of the role play, and you and maybe a select couple other people are involved in it, and everyone else isn't. So you're basically creating a within role play experience that most people are not actually experiencing. So again, it is the everyone putting in 100%, and most people aren't getting 100% out of it. So by creating those experiences, you are effectively contributing to that dilution.
This brought back a memory from gang roleplay I was talking about earlier, right? I do explicitly remember multiple people expressing that they were like afraid to go on vacation because they were afraid about what would happen in the role play. That is how bad it got. And then the people who did go on vacation were proven right. Their fear was proven right because I remember specifically someone had gone on like a literal 2-day vacation, and then when they had to come back, the role play had changed entirely, and it was like outside of regular session time, right? And the role play had changed entirely. It was just about something different when then they had come back. So it's like they were even proven right? The fear was justified. Outside of, yeah, Waffle says, well, I missed 2 sessions. Now my character has all but written down the story. I would agree, but they hadn't even missed, missing 2 sessions is like understating what had happened because of course these were like player organized irregular sessions that weren't planned for, right? So it wasn't like the official gang roleplay sessions that they had missed. It was like the unofficial player organized sessions that they had missed, so like missing 2 sessions is honestly an understatement in that case. And yeah, once again, there's something to be said about personal responsibility and like being okay with missing out on stuff, but this is not that. This is not that. This is explicitly creating an environment that is going to push other people harder or force them to miss out on things that they didn't expect, right, when they had signed up for, right? So that's, I think, quite different.
Yeah, I mean, we basically have to call this what it is, right? It's unhealthy to have those sorts of unclear expectations, and it is unhealthy to set up this network of social pressure, because that is what it becomes, right? Like, to be involved in a full capacity, you have to do X, Y, and Z, and there is pressure that because someone else is capable of doing it, that you could basically be the person that sits there and says, bullying isn't real, just close the laptop. but it's not that simple at all because, again,
Mhm.
these role plays are social communities, right? When
Yeah.
you do get involved in a role play, you're effectively entering a community where people can befriend each other and build this trust outside of the scope of the role play itself. So you are in a community, you are in a space where there is some level of social pressure to conform to the space. And if conforming to the space involves conforming to the person who is setting the boundary for the amount of time that you're supposed to be dedicated to it, that is a social pressure to further involve yourself more and more and more and more with the space, which can come at the detriment of your physical health, your time, your other responsibilities, right? And at that
Mhm.
point, it's very easy to say, just disconnect, just leave the group. But that's hard, right? Because, like, you enjoy the project, right? You might enjoy what it is. You might still want to be a part of it, right? You might have a really good group of friends inside of there that you've gotten close to, and like leaving that space would mean you interact less with them, right? There's so much baggage behind the just leave the group smile counter argument that I think is like very very heavily oversimplifying the like social ramifications of this,
Mhm.
especially because of how intrinsically directly tied all of these groups within our space are, because all of these role players for the most part are involved in either a bunch of different groups or a bunch of different projects. The interconnectedness of this space is insane. You will see the same people literally everywhere.
Mhm.
So like
Yeah.
disconnecting in one direction doesn't mean you can just go to another space and expect that everything is like perfectly separate.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Waffle basically like reinforcing this. If you don't like how the thing is run, just leave the project. But I love the players, and the setting, and the feeling of being there. It's like I enjoy all of this, right? As a participant, I am enjoying the experience of being here and the people that are here and the subject matter that we're exploring. And this is something that I may not be able to find elsewhere. But at the same time, being here and my personal responsibility recognizes that being here in the capacity that involves me to the point where I can actually feel like I'm a part of this and I belong here is unhealthy for me in some capacity.
Mhm. Yeah. I will. I will add because I entirely agree with your summary here. I will add to the unhealthy. I will also add that I do think like continuing on like this is not just unhealthy. It's also unfair and explicitly disrespectful to your co-players. Um, I would add that, you know.
Yeah.
There's an asterisk, right? And we did mention this asterisk at the beginning of the, you know, of the session, right? And I think it'll make a bit more sense now in hindsight, right? Like if you have your, you know, 24/7 role play where you tell your players, you know, you are expected in order to get full value of this role play, you are expected to kind of like schedule private scenes with your co-players and like have, you know, at least this much extra time per week, right? Or else you're not going to get the full value out of this role play. um I still think that would be unhealthy personally, but at that point, at the very least, right, once you kind of like set that expectation explicitly, right, explicitly into the rules of your role play, that you are, you like, you know, you're demanding more of your players, you're demanding this much more, at the very least at that point it's no longer unfair and disrespectful, you know. I still think, you know, spending, you know, that much time and like making it 24/7 is probably still unhealthy. At the very least, it's no longer going to be disrespectful and unfair.
Right.
Um, the reason it is disrespectful and unfair is when you promise something, right? When something is promised in a role play and something entirely different is delivered. It's kind of like, you know, false advertising per se. I think um, saying that your role play is X amount of times per week and then allowing people to do like way more than that is a form of false advertising, I think.
Mm-hmm. It's very much like our previous discussions about like communication and thematic consistency, right? If you say a role play is going to be a certain way and it ends up being another way, you feel kind of cheated, right? Like if you came in thinking you were going to have the like standard kind of town role play with like the small rebel faction, and then everyone wants to be a part of the rebel faction, and you don't manage that, then the role play becomes a rebel faction role play because everyone submitted the rebel faction character. Same basically goes for time constraints, right? Because if you assume that you can set aside 4 hours of your week every week to do the role play and be adequately fulfilled, and then you realize there's a soft end, and then a bunch of people are doing 8 to 10 hours plus some, then you realize that your 4 hours pales in comparison the moment you have started to ramp up in the role play, and everyone else is progressing their characters far more than yours. And it's not to say that roleplay is necessarily competitive, at least not at its root. There are some like there are certainly some competitive elements, and that's fine and all. But it is certainly a very it's kind of a downtrodden experience when you are putting in what you believe is your 100%, and then finding that other people are effectively like outpacing you and getting involved in more things and getting more fulfillment out of their experience than you are. And in a lot of ways, this can be equated to some degree to the experience of submitting a character halfway through a season or sometime into the roleplay after characters have already effectively established a bunch of bonds between each other. If you've ever done that, then you kind of understand what I mean when I say that you have a lot of catching up to do. You have a lot of trust to build. You have a lot to make up for, and to get to these really interesting sort of emotional points with your roleplay. You can't just start out a character just swinging in all of these like really strong thematic points, because like the character still needs to establish himself. You need to kind of ramp up on these like sorts of internal conflicts and getting involved in certain elements of the roleplay that takes a lot of time. So again, the more time that people spend, the better equipped they are to deal with all that, and the more time they have to ramp up. So they're the ones that are getting to those points before you, and again, equating to that late character submission. If you're kind of sitting in that position of trying to ramp into that position of the roleplay to become a more storied character, to become more involved with the subject matter of the roleplay, and to become more involved in the player with the other characters within the setting, then you've got a lot of time to make up for. Now, consider being in that position and also being outpaced by everyone else in that regard. That just feels kind of hopeless at that point, right? So that I think is a good consideration to have if you ever have been in that position of like a late character submission. It effectively feels like that if you haven't ever been in the soft end, less time than everyone else sort of situation. That is very much what it feels like.
Yeah. Shoot. I was going to have a topic here, but give me a second. I need to remind myself.
Okay. I guess I can.
Shoot.
I did say I was going to get back to another one of Waffle's points, so I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you can think on that while I go back to this. So, Waffle says, what was it, half an hour ago? One of the main issues they have with Nebulous extra credit sessions, like text RP, soft ends, whatever, is that those cannot logistically be DM'd properly, so people can get away with making stuff up and ending up in a broken or semi-broken game state. Yeah, that is very much true. There is a higher need of trust for spaces that do not have as much people because a big part of the trust of roleplay is that other people are present to be able to react to and manage the situations that come up. So by having less people involved selectively, um, you're also you're also effectively removing some of the barriers and checks and balances that would normally keep things kind of in check or within the scope, so to speak. So, not to mention the issues that already kind of arise with it, is this just like creates such a higher need for trust? Because you effectively, as a GM, would have to full stop trust your players to uh, allow or to not allow anything to get out of hand, which is
So
very hard, right? Go on.
so tell me if you've ever heard this one, Celis, on this topic. Tell me if you've ever heard this one.
Sure.
Um, or it's like, okay, it's okay to, it's okay to have like, you know, private sessions or like sessions, but as long as, if the GMs aren't there, just don't do anything plot important.
Oh God, I have I have heard this distinction. I've heard many people try to draw this distinction, not only with one-off between characters things, but just generally quote unquote social sessions,
The
right?
social lobby,
Social
yeah.
the
Don't
social
do
lobby.
anything plot important.
Yes,
Let's
everything
talk about that.
everything is plot important. Everything you do is plot important. The plot, okay. So let's kind of separate the layers here, right? You have the plot, which is usually a core central driven uh, kind of thematic progression of the roleplay that actually dictates how the larger sessions kind of pan out and everything. And that's usually GM led, and that tends to be what the plot of the larger story is. But then you get that lower layer of like what the player and the character experience is like, and the progression of that character's uh, core struggles and uh, rising actions and all that kind of stuff about their story, because every character does experience their own story. Uh, there is no point at which any 15 minutes within your standard session is less important for that character than the 15 minutes that happens in your social session. These are the exact same thing. Saying one is more important than the other is ridiculous. I'm just going to
Yeah.
lay that out flat. There is absolutely no circumstance in which any of these two are more important than the other, just by virtue of one being part of a social session, quote unquote, and one being part of any other kind of session, which is why I really, really dislike that distinction, because it basically gives the excuse to say, I'm just creating more time for the sake of saying, oh, this time is okay because nothing important is going to happen here. But that's not true.
So so yeah, I would say like the thing with like central plot is there once again there are two exceptions, right? Exception number one, if your role play is small enough that everybody's in the same room all the time, or right, if you have a main character, which if you have like a dedicated main character, in which case you probably shouldn't be doing a role play, but aside from those two cases, no one in your roleplay is actually going to be, experiencing the core GM-led plot of the roleplay, right? Like the core like GM-led plot, whatever, right? It is not actually all that core. The only thing that's real in sort of in like a large roleplay project, like from the perspective of the players, is their own character's journey, right?
Hmm.
Each individual person's character journey is their own plot, right? That is the plot that is happening, right? Each person is kind of going through their own individual character's journey. And, to say that that's not important, right, is to kind of like say that, roleplay as itself is not important, right? Like that is the important part, because nobody, unless you have a dedicated main character, which is also not good, nobody is actually going to be experiencing the whole plot of your roleplay. Air quotes plot, the central GM led plot. And yeah, so saying that just don't do anything important or don't do anything plot relevant on the social session is, I think, a very flawed that's a very flawed understanding, right? In fact, I would say that sort of those quiet character moments, I would say, are usually more important than whatever's going on in the sort of central, like, GM led mission. Is more important to that character's story. It might be less flashy, it might be less than like whatever cool mission you have planned out. But I would argue that from the perspective of each character's individual journey, those moments are significantly more important than whatever central GM led plots or whatever central plot the GMs have cooked up.
So this is for those that may or may not be familiar. I not too long before Couchform actually ended up writing a very related manifesto on via roleplay that actually explored this exact topic of extra credit, and soft RP is the term that I tackled here, and that this is kind of the way that people have differentiated here, that you have like your important roleplay and you have your soft roleplay. And I basically made the point that soft RP does not exist as a term. It does not, because again, implying that it does implies that people roleplay in less meaningful ways sometimes, and because role-playing inherently values the lived experience of the character, unless you're willing to confidently say that 1 second of a character's lived experience is any more important than the next without analyzing what happens within that second, then it should make sense that soft RP does not exist. Just full stop. This is one I'm really passionate about.
Yeah. And so, like, those relationships, right? Specifically, like, the relationships that are formed during these, air quotes, social sessions. It's kind of foolish to think that they won't go on to be majorly impactful over the course of a roleplay, right? That's kind of they just will, like, matter of factly. It will affect everything from that point onwards. So it definitely isn't less important. That's for sure.
Right. So I've got another question for you. We haven't actually touched on this very much. How do you feel about downtime notes?
Downtime notes, I mean, just, I don't know. I guess it depends. I think it depends on roleplay, and also, like, I think it's only extra credit, right? If you're, like, springing things on people, right? So in the topic of extra credit, downtime is only extra credit if you're springing, like, unexpected stuff. I actually wasn't complaining. Like, we had downtime notes as well in gang roleplay. I've left that out of my complaints because that was actually adhered to. We had downtime notes once a week at the same time every week, and that was it. That was all. So I think it's kind of like the same thing in the terms of extra credit. It's kind of like the same thing. It's, do you is it kind of expected? Now, when I'm talking about downtime notes here, this was like a specific mechanic of, like, your character does stuff during the week, and it was like actually like systematized as like you can do sort of this sort of thing once per week, right? And like write a short blurb. Um, what I suspect you are talking about here, though, is the sort of unstructured downtime notes where people just kind of like have the option to write about what their characters were doing throughout the week.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not specifically tied into any specific mechanic. I imagine that's what you're talking about.
Yep.
I see. Okay. Um, that sort of downtime notes. Yeah, I mean, I don't see it as much different than text roleplay. Um, I mean, I don't know. Like, it's kind of hard to say. Like, if it's one way, right, and one way only, then like theoretically it might not be so bad. Like I don't care if people go and do their own creative writing project as to like what's going on. Um, it's often easy to say that it's one way, and then I recall all the times where like people are like going after other people and like pinging each other to like you know pinging each other on the downtime notes, or like yeah, it gets a bit weird. It has the potential to get a bit weird. I've never seen it. I've never seen that in particular go quite as bad as other things. But I suppose that there's no reason that people couldn't then, in the absence of things like scheduling private sessions or, 24/7 text RP, I see no reason why people then couldn't move to downtime notes as their outlet for extra credit. I think possibly like the reason that I haven't seen it be used too much for extra credit is because there are other outlets that are more effective. Um, yeah, I don't know.
I think there's
That
um
that's
there's also the notion of like how much time it takes to write some of these out sometimes. Uh, just a standard like downtime notes can be pretty benign, depending on like
mhm,
how involved you want players to be with writing it out, or even like just a recap of the things that are happening in the episode. Um, the extension of that then becomes how detailed do we want to be? How much do I have to track? How much do I have to write out
mhm,
about what I'm planning, et cetera, et cetera. This was very much a Fractured Thrones thing, and I don't know of any other roleplay that has like gone this far, where as players we were effectively forced to write something out about exactly what our character was up to, uh, what we were planning to do the next session, and what was happening in between, which is like very little space, so people usually didn't do that. But that was always like quite a bit of time of me having a bad memory and usually going back to these like recordings of sessions. So it basically required me to have recorded my session that I could go back and actually write out confidently what it was that I was up to and communicate that. And that took quite a while. It usually took like at least a couple hours. And
mhm,
it mostly became it mostly ended up being extra credit just because um, the people that are able to communicate the things to Brunswick would effectively have them supported as they went forward in the role play, or at least more likely to. And B, this was not something that we started out with. This is something that came about afterward, and we were effectively forced to do it uh, for fear of being yelled at for not doing it. So there was absolutely a lot of pressure to add those couple hours.
mhm. Yeah, I'll have to say during Worlds Apart, I remember I think most of our players participated in downtime notes. Out of those, most of players, I think approximately half of them would regularly drop novels in the chat, like
Yeah.
literal novels. Um, from the GM end, we asked people to keep it short, 3 sentences.
It never
Those 3
happened.
sentences turned into 3 paragraphs and then into 3 pages, you know?
Yeah.
And I stopped reading them. I just didn't read. If it was longer than 3 sentences, I just didn't read it. It was like that's basically where I was with it, because that was also kind of unreasonable, right? Like if you're, if your GMs are like, we're going to read your stuff to keep track of it, please keep it to like 3 sentences, and you drop like a novel every week, like, also don't give your organizers extra credit, right? Like, just don't do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was that was another one too, I think. Um, Now, if it's specifically like, I think if you kind of leave it as like a sort of creating writing exercise, and that's it, and like your GMs say that they're not going to bother reading it, just this channel is open for creative writing, basically. I think that's pretty benign if it's enforced that people are using it that way. Um, and it's like specifically one way, so you're not doing back and forth roleplay in the channel. You're not pulling other people into it, right? Um, as long as that's met, I think is pretty benign. When you start like making things matter, when you start making the downtime notes matter in the roleplay, then you have to crack down a little bit, right? Then I think um, you have to like kind of standardize what's going on. I will do the obligatory, it's the last episode. I'm gonna reset the counter. We're gonna do the obligatory Vampire the Masquerade reference here. Um, it's been a while actually.
It
It's it's
has.
it's, it's been a bit. Yeah, Niana was telling me how like downtime notes is like an inherent part of that game, where it's the downtime notes.
What game?
But Vampire the Masquerade.
There it is.
Yeah,
Yeah, just say it.
downtime notes is like an inherent part of that role playing game, and there's like a big sort of like emphasis placed on like stuff happening like out of session and like the world moving forward. In order to support that, however, you do one session a month, which then you do the session, you give your GMs 1 week of break, then on the second week you write your downtime notes, and then you give the GMs a week to come up with responses to the downtime notes, and then you have your session again, right? So in order to support those downtime notes, right, like Neon was telling me that those games usually run once a month, right? Because like, yeah, it's kind of hard, having done and having like read through those downtime notes, like having had that experience, like even reading them takes a long time, right? Because it's like reading them times 40 and then coming up with responses. Like, geez, if you were taking a minute per person, it's still going to be like an hour, and it's going to be way more than a minute per person, let me tell you. Especially if you're like, if somebody's like, I'm writing a letter to like another character, and then you have to like come up with a in-character response, right? Like, geez, it's like multiple hours of work that
Right.
you're giving your staff team every time you do that. And yeah, so I think the once a month, in the case of Vampire, I think the once a month session with like halfway in between you do your downtime notes, I think that's very fair. I think that's much more fair than kind of like doing the session and then doing downtime notes and allowing people to do downtime notes up until the day before the session, or like maybe even hours before the session, and expecting that GMs like read that. That's also extra credit,
Mm-hmm.
That's also extra credit. Um,
Like,
Now,
go on.
yeah, I think the reason I wasn't thinking, I didn't complain about that in Gang RP is because that's actually a thing that we didn't do. That was a thing that we didn't use for extra credit. Wow, it was
Oh my
great.
god.
But yeah, I do think if your role play is going to do stuff, have the downtime notes kind of reflect into the role play in any way, shape, or form, where it's not purely a creative writing exercise for players who want to engage with that, I think at that point, you know, you have to start viewing that as extra credit too.
Yep. And like I get to further comment on VTM, the reason why it's so well structured is not only because of the time and space in between, right? Is because it is deliberately communicated as a structured part of the roleplay, in that VTM focuses on the kind of political intrigue and power shifts and dynamics. The downtime is specifically the space to do and accomplish things that are big. That is the point of the downtime notes. They are meant for players to be able to, uh, you know, go on these like missions and get something out of it, or like
You can do your corporate espionage, or like, you know, talk to your spy network,
yeah,
or like sabotage, you know, the other players like domains or whatever. I don't actually know what goes on, but I imagine stuff like that would
yeah.
um
It's all the big stuff, right? Like everything that's like big that would, in our cases, normally be represented within a session. They do it out of sessions in downtime notes, and that is deliberate because when they get back
everybody
into
gets to
session,
do it.
yeah, and then like because the reason why is because when they get into session, then they can focus on the interpersonal power play, right? That is like effectively the core of the experience of the role play, that they expect players to want to be involved in that. So they say, hey, we're going to run downtime nodes so you guys do all of like the other like adventuring and like sabotage stuff outside of that. You'll get results from that, and then you get to work with that in session in your like interpersonal uh, power slash intrigue sorts of play, and that's what the session is dedicated to. So that's all communicated. That's all part of the experience. It has its purpose, so it's good, right? This is absolutely something that is intended to be part of the project and the experience, and that is effectively taking its space in a very reasonable way. And everyone's entering the contract knowing that that is part of the experience. So that's very good. That I find to be very good. Now, I'm actually very sad that Waffle just left, because there were a couple of things that Waffle commented on that I wanted to like have a longer discussion with Waffle on. So I think I will say what my thoughts are on it, and then I'll reach out to Waffle later on to see what they think on my responses, because I am going to push back here. So Waffle says they don't know if they necessarily agree with our thoughts on like the importance of certain kinds of roleplay versus others, though it depends on how you define important. One can certainly roleplay as an existing character in a non-canon lobby, like if I took Craig to Purple Lotus, Craig being their ATK character, and I would not consider that important roleplay. My rebuttal to that would be very immediately, that is because you are not roleplaying in ATK. You are roleplaying in the Purple Lotus, which entirely does not affect the events of ATK. That is your participation in the Purple Lotus. Metaverse is a bit of a mixed bag in that the Metaverse roleplays are very much tied to each other. But when it comes to crossing that plane of like things that should never exist with each other, then generally speaking, you're not going to see much impact between the two. Right? That being said, I think there is still a bit of extra credit happening there. I don't think it's nearly as problematic as if you had something within the same space. But there is very much like some form of comfort being built within whatever group you manage to kind of stick around with in that space. And although the events definitely do not carry over, there is some level of like proximity and trust that is kind of carried over, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like that might be a sort of like a sort of subconscious thing, which I mean, I don't really want to dig too deep into that, because I have no idea. I think obviously if you like spend more time with another person's character that you're like going to be role playing, outside of the role play, like there might be something to be said there about
Yeah.
like even if you don't explicitly carry over anything, you might like kind of implicitly carry over something. I don't have much to say about that. I don't have any like concrete things to say. Um, I do actually have an example of that. I know Gangarpy itself was a metaverse, but we still were kind of like limited in like where we could go in metaverse and like what we could do. I do remember a specific case of us going to like I think like the purple lotus there was specifically used for extra credit like a lot of the time. We would kind of like host our we would kind of like host our sessions with people who we weren't really supposed to talk to in the purple lotus, or alternatively at the dream tree. And like the dream tree is like designed to be like non-canon canon, where like unless your character like has some special dream powers or whatever, you're not going to remember anything when you wake up. So it was like, it was the loophole, a way to have non-canon canon roleplay, uh, under the guise of your character's not supposed to remember anything when they wake up. Um, Lovely lobby otherwise. But I do think that kind of did it did enable some things that I would consider extra credit. Of course, in that case, Gangarpy did exist within the metaverse, and but yeah. So I think it's kind of hard to say. I, maybe once more sensible, extra credit like rules are instated, maybe we might have a problem with this sometime in the future. But as of this moment, I don't have too much of a problem with this yet. The sort of, non-canon. As long as you clearly mark it as non-canon, I don't have anything concrete to call out quite yet.
Hmm.
Um,
And that's why I say it's like not nearly as much of a problem, right? Like
yeah,
if you have like
may become a problem in the future. I would be open
yeah.
to the idea that it may become a problem in the future. I mean, we'll get to that when we get to that.
Right, right,
Uh,
right. So I've got another topic for us to talk about, and we've
mhm.
actually talked about this before, so I think you'll have probably some similar thoughts the last time. Extra credit within sessions, right? Like, for example,
What do you mean?
uh, so we've talked about this in the context of people being able to submit things into the map, right? Like, I have effectively created the thing that only I get to
Ah,
experience,
okay.
i.e., I add the
Whew.
prop to my to my character's own space. So I now have the photo of my character by my bed.
Okay. Yes, I see. I see that that's a bit different than extra credit within. That's a bit different than what I was thinking when you said extra credit within session. All right.
Hmm.
Solus is talking about. I guess there's a very specific example that pops in my head, but I think the way that I will describe this problem is, I would say this is extra credit in terms of what people are like capable of doing. I don't even know if this is like I don't even know if this is called in session, but this is kind of like taking your outside of session skills and time so that you get more out of your session. Uh, in some ways, like the specific thing that is being referenced is kind of like what would happen if somebody like either asked staff or designed themselves something to be put into the world or the map of the role play, right? And thereby this is something now that's like unique and specific to that character that is now being put into the map. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's definitely part of it.
Things like that. I'll
Yeah.
I'll I'll actually. I think I am very radical in this sense. I think I am very. I have a very extreme opinion on this. Um, I think this is absolutely extra credit. In multiple ways. Right. First of all, please back to the topic of like I think I've talked about like map makers and like map designers. Treat your organizers well. It's like, gosh, I saw the laundry list of requests that we had in like Worlds Apart for stuff to be added to the map. And in a sense, people were understanding that we didn't get to all of them just because there was a huge freaking list, and like, gosh, that weekly cycle is really hard. I would go to the extreme of just like not doing it, because if you do it for some people and not for others, even if it's like first come first served, I think that's kind of unfair. It's unfair to the people who are more vocal and more and less. Sorry, it's going to be beneficial to the people who are less respectful to the time of the organizers, right? Because those people are going to speak up and ask for more things. The people who are, less respectful, the people who are afraid, right, and are like really thinking about like, oh, I don't want, I don't want the organizers to worry too much or like have too much to do. I don't want to overwork the map makers. Those people are now going to miss out, right? The people who are the most respectful are now going to miss out. So that's my first thought. Um, Kind of like on the organizer end of things. Second thought, um, I think kind of like using your out of character kind of skills here, where it's like if somebody's like really excellent at like world building or like avatar making or script writing or whatever, and is going to come under the guise of lessening the work for the map maker, right? Where it's like, now, the map maker doesn't need to put this thing into the world because I've brought, my own prefab that you can just drag and drop into the map, right? Therefore, it's not going to be a lot of work on your part. I still think that's extra credit. I still think that's kind of unfair for the same reason of, you're diminishing other people's experiences. Not everybody's going to be able to have access to that, right? Not everybody's going to have access to that ability. And if it's not an expected part of your roleplay, that you're submitting your own scripts into the map, right? Then I think it's just once again unfair and disrespectful to everyone else if you're going to do that. Even if you're saving and you're no longer asking the map maker and you're saving the map maker their time, right? You're still diminishing other people's experiences by essentially bringing more stuff into the role play for yourself and no one else, right?
So I think just to kind of interject there, I think the real operating factor of this is just for yourself, right? Because like
Yeah.
I think all of the times that we have gotten like really frustrated about these kind of instances, specifically in World Apart, because I know we've kind of noticed quite a few of those, and I myself am guilty of at least one. Is that these end up being things that were like, do this for me, for my experience, for my room, for my character, and not to impact anyone else. There are absolutely circumstances where someone can put in that time to contribute at a broader scale, and it's something that everyone can enjoy. Uh, I don't know if this is a good enough example, but I know Aussie Sophie has quite a bit of time on her hands, tends to draw a lot of art, and created an art piece for Varsity Booze to be presented inside of the faculty building. And it's just there, right? It absolutely is something that would have spent some time to get onto a decal of some sort and then put onto the map. So it does kind of have the same kind of time considerations. Uh, but then again, it is also something that everyone can kind of look at and say, oh, this is something that was created and put on. It kind of contributes a little bit to the open space here. It is not something that only one person has personally for their experience. It is something that everyone looks at. Art is just kind of one of those things that people that are generally more artistic will kind of just have the ability to put in that time and creative energy to add to things, and whether or not that is too much for someone to keep up with the person who is creating things just based on their own like enjoyment and free time, that is definitely very dependent on the circumstance.
Hmm.
But at the very least, the fact that this is something that was meant to be displayed openly and like for everyone to enjoy and take part in is something that absolutely helps. When it is specifically meant to be siloed and isolated and only for the person who is submitting it, then the point is much less defensible, right? Like when I'll speak on my own case here to not necessarily justify it completely because I know there was quite a bit of pushback and I understand it more now that I've kind of taken this point of view in that uh, about midway through Worlds Apart, I had recognized that we had a sort of like empty games parlor, and I was like thinking about what kind of board games do we have, what kind of card games, so what kind of like things that a society like this would kind of put together, and I realized chess, right? There's something about the 8x8 board that I feel like would be consistent. It's just such a good standard. It's something that could easily be like a convergent cognizance sort of thing where we just separate peoples would converge onto the 8x8 checkered board with like opposing pieces. It just feels right. So I was like, okay, I want to add a chess like game to the map. And my thought was, I'm going to at least put the feelers out of like requesting a chess like board. And that basically got nowhere, right? There was not enough time for people to, in development, kind of look for an asset that made sense for it. And I was at some point thinking, I'm probably going to have to do this myself. So I ended up doing it. I ended up kind of custom making a bunch of pieces and trying to bring it in line with performance considerations of the map and all that good stuff. And then I was kind of looking at what I had and submitted it. And this was absolutely one of those cases of I have made the thing and I put it in there. And I, at first, had the kind of baseline expectation that this is going to be easy. I didn't really think about how many people are doing the I submitted the thing, it's easy, you can put it in there. And so the pushback was basically, well, I'm going to need to instance some of these meshes, and then I have to put pickups on all of these different pieces, and it became more work than I anticipated they would have to do, and that was something I hadn't considered. That being said, I will at least take some level of credit for the consideration that this wasn't just something for me to experience. This was something that I wanted to be within the open space of the games parlor, so that people could come in and just relax while playing this game. And I will say the game itself was a bit of a mistake because it's a very high time investment game that would force people to spend a lot of brain power on it and not actually role playing. So I had played it quite a few times in character myself, and certainly it was certainly taking a lot out of the time economy of my roleplay sessions, which I didn't find too much of a problem for myself, but lesson learned. But in the
Yeah.
end, definitely something I wanted other people to experience, and at the very least, the people that did try it out and did look forward to playing it, I got a lot of positive feedback from those people. They said they really enjoyed it and they thought it was really cool. So I was happy for that at least.
For what it's worth, I suppose the games parlor was at least utilized.
Mhm.
I suppose a consideration to any designers out there, like I really do think you're right that like things being public makes it better because a little bit of insight into the development. We basically on the team, we basically like crowdsourced player housing. Obviously, Sizzle was kind of in charge of the map and did the vast majority of the map work, like the actual modeling part. Um, every single one of our staff members, I think, like kind of all four of us, all four of us GMs, I'm pretty sure all of us decorated at least one of the houses. We kind of like crowdsourced that because it was just like a monumental task to do so. And I think the amount of time that was spent on decorating like the each individual houses, how sparse they still were, even after that monumental task, and then how little they ended up being used, all things considered. Like, man, I feel like the individual player house updates, I'm just a no-go on that, right? Like how few people those updates kind of affect versus how much time it takes is just not feasible for something on a weekly schedule like that, I think, right? Like unless like that's a if it was a job to update that map, maybe, but it's not.
Right.
It certainly is really nice, right? Like I won't argue, having that space, having the space be, air quotes yours on the map. It's very nice. It's very, you know, it's like a really good feeling. But my goodness, was that like that was the majority of the map development time was personalizing those houses and seeing how little they were actually utilized in the grand scheme of things. It just kind of, you know, other parts of the map, which had much shorter development time, were way more utilized. Um, I really do think the player owned houses is like one of those things which like feels really good. It looks really nice, but it's just in the grand scheme of things, like customizing them especially, not that important.
Mm-hmm.
In the grand scheme of things, the effort versus reward. Anyway, um, that's like my thought on it from like a development perspective. I won't argue against it being nice. It's just because it is, right? It is a nice thing. It's just like I would put that on like the lowest of low priority personally, right? Um, yeah, that's where I would go. I guess stuff like the games parlor where it's like a public space, I feel like that's a step better because the moment something is a public space, now theoretically, anyone can experience it, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
rather than just the one person. So now the time investment is maybe a bit more worth it, right? On the scale of the role play. You need fewer of those public spaces to accomplish the same effect as customizing, right? You need fewer public spaces that you need to customize in order to get the same effect as if you were to individually customize a private house for each character, um,
Right.
because they're public. Um, I suppose that's tangentially related to extra credit. Um, I've saved my most radical opinion here for last. I feel like this one is like true silent hot take. Are you ready?
Go for it.
Are you ready?
Yep.
I've saved it for last. I've been
Mm-hmm.
talking about maps. I'm gonna talk about avatars. I'm gonna do it
Do it.
because I know that we're in VR chat here, and VR roleplay specifically in the space that we exist in is very very sort of like self-expression. Right? It's a lot about self-expression. There's a lot about creating your avatar to like express your character and express yourself. Right? A lot of people put a lot of work into their avatars. I want to talk about expectations surrounding those things. I will have, another story from Gang Roleplay. At the very beginning of Gang Roleplay, the promise, the kind of selling point of the roleplay was that nobody was there. There were no main characters. and we would all kind of be participating, and everybody had the same avatar, right? Everybody had the same customizable avatar, and we were all there, and everybody was on the same thing. And some people occasionally were chosen mostly randomly to go on missions, and at the beginning it was like I fully believe that at the beginning it was like actually basically randomly. It very much, even in hindsight, appears that way to me, that at the beginning it was pretty much random. Um, but yeah, everybody had the same model. Everybody was on the same playing field. That was the promise of gang roleplay. Then somebody made the first custom avatar. And then within 2 months of somebody making the first custom avatar, everybody had custom avatars. And like, it was never written out of the rules, right? During my time in the roleplay, it was always in the rules that everybody's kind of on equal ground. You're all playing characters, and at some point it became like you can absolutely use the sort of the default, air quotes, NPC avatar. But by that point, it was actually an NPC avatar because basically nobody but the NPCs used it at that point. Um, Everybody was now using custom avatars, and the expectation had drifted from you can just join this role play and you can be you can just play with this avatar that we have provided for you. That expectation was very quickly shifted to, in order to seriously get involved in this role play, you need to have a custom avatar. And that shifting of expectations is, I think, the very nature here of extra credit. That kind of promise was broken. It was broken very quickly too. For a very long time, you could still join the roleplay using that customizable avatar that everybody had access to, but you couldn't participate in the roleplay in the same way that everybody else was participating, right? Everybody else was like updating their avatars whenever they got a new item, or whenever the character went on a dangerous mission. You would add like some people would add like scars or like tattoos to their model, or whatever, things that like evidenced like the things that they had done, and that was like a very popular way of participating in this roleplay, that anybody who was using the default the default customizable avatar just couldn't participate in. And I think it's no wonder that basically nobody ended up using the default customizable avatar. I say basically nobody because one person did stick it out almost to the very end. Even they eventually got a custom avatar. Now, once again, this is not a rant against custom avatars. This is a rant against the shifting of expectations here. Now, I will once again I will now rant about a more subtle, right? This is like a more subtle expectation, right? Because I think most role plays, right? Most role plays do expect that you bring a custom avatar, right? Gang RP was very much the exception to the rule at that time. Kind of being like, okay, everybody is using the same model. That was very much the exception to the rule. I think most role plays do, however, kind of expect that you bring custom avatars. But there was that thing that I was talking about, right? The participation in the role play via evidence and kind of like changes to your character over time is a very popular way for people to participate in a role play. And it's something that's like very very cool, and very, and I think it's no wonder that people do it. I think this has the potential to turn into extra credit as well if it's not not kind of kept under wraps. And this is why in Worlds Apart we did have an official rule, a very official rule of like, yes, the seasons are going to be changing in character, but we will explicitly not require anybody to actually change their clothes to reflect that. And also, the same thing with the common sense disguise rules, right? It's like we had the disguise rule of like, if you want to disguise, the most you have to do if you put like a mask on your face, you don't actually have to change up your character to be actually disguised. Just I don't know, just like put a mask on the avatar and you can call it a day. That counts as you being disguised. You know, same thing. Common sense disguise rules, I think, kind of fall into the same thing. I really do think that like more of these like sort of common sense avatar work expectations are good and positive. And I also do think that when you are participating in a role play that has these rules, right? Has these rules. Um, I think the disguise rules have been mostly adopted by most people. But this is another thing that I saw in Worlds Apart was when we did say that it's officially winter. I did see some people going around to other characters who were in t-shirts and saying stuff like, you know, aren't you cold? Uh, you look like you need a sweater or something like that. And it's like we've established, you know, the rule where it's like this is we don't want to force people to have like, you know, a winter version of their models. We don't want to force them to like make a new outfit. This is not part of this role play, right? This form of extra credit is not part of this role play. Keep an eye out for those things, and please, you know, please respect those when it comes up. So I think that's, you know, the perpetual model work. A lot of people really like that, but I think that is also very dangerously close, or very dangerous on the path of being extra credit, basically.
Is that the hot take?
Yeah, it's the hot take because it's the hot take, I think, because of how prevalent sort of like avatar and like avatar work is,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah,
that
yeah.
customization is like the lifeblood of VR roleplay, right?
Yeah, I get you.
But I still think it has to be recognized that like there are some, you know, common sense rules that disguise rules. Once again, disguise rules are, I think, like that's a very common sense rule. If you want your character to put in disguise, I don't think it's reasonable to ask people to make a whole new model just because they want to disguise. I don't think that's
Yeah.
reasonable. I
Yeah.
think it's I think most other people don't think that's reasonable too, which is why, you know, why it's gone through, right? Um I also think there are other things like that. There are other things like that, like what I was talking about, you know, like for example, you know, the beach episode, or for example, you know, the winter episode or whatever, you know, like things where in real life you might expect a change of clothes, but in VR role play it might be a bit more difficult than just changing your clothes, you know?
Right.
Um, I think that's important to think about at the very least, and have guidelines as to what is and isn't expected in your role play. Um, Clear guidelines that don't change from week to week, like they might have in gang role play.
Yeah.
Uh, where one week it was if you don't have it on your model, it doesn't exist. And then the next week it was like, okay, we'll assume that everybody's wearing a Kevlar vest under their outfit. Um, I don't think it matters what the expectation is as long as it's clear and well communicated. Because at that point, people can make their own informed decisions as to whether or not they have that time to put in for model work, or whether or not they, you know, have the money to commission that model work.
You know, the warp example is always very interesting to me. I'll voice some, like, I don't know how much I agree. Uh, just on the basis that this is a rather nebulous sort of consideration, and I think that's kind of what you're hinting at, right? Is it's something that can become extra credit, but isn't always, uh, because it's very hard to draw the line, right? It's very hard to determine when something becomes extra credit versus like it being a creative expression of adding
Mhm.
to a model and doing some cool things with it. The warp example
I
is very interesting
mhm.
because it was something that was very hard not to comment on, and I did this quite a bit. I can see where it can be pressure. I can also see where it can be taken with stride. Where the example of, you know, aren't you cold could very easily be rebutted with, you know, I grew up in a cold environment. It's fine for me. Or like, you know, I'm actually used to this or something like that. Like can kind of bring that around. That being
I'm
said,
specifically thinking of a situation in my mind right now where it was, "Aren't you cold?" "No." And then that conversation continued basically of like, right, of like, the response was like, "No, I'm not." And then but then it like kept going, right? Like, and like, I don't know, like, yes, I don't think it's a problem to add, I don't think it's a problem to add that winter code to your model, right? That is once again the lifeblood of the role play. Um, I also don't necessarily think it's a problem if you like, whether accidentally or on purpose, kind of like point it out that like, somebody's they're in a t-shirt, whatever. Um, and at that point, it's kind of like you let the other person engage with that if they want to. I think, right?
yeah,
It's like if the other person wants to continue engaging with that role play, they can do that, right? They can make it clear that they want to engage with that role play. I don't think you should assume that the other person wants to, especially when there's an explicit rule like put in place, right?
yeah,
I think at that point, if somebody wants to be, like, "Oh shoot, I forgot my jacket, I'm cold," at that point, it's on that person to make other people aware that yes, I want to participate in this sort of role play, right? And I
right.
think that's perfectly fine.
So the question
That
itself is
can
like
exist.
benign enough, right? It's like, it's the signal of like, I'm asking you whether you are okay with playing out whether it's cold for your character or not, and the person
Yeah.
could respond, no, I'm actually used to this, or yeah, you're right, let's get indoors somewhere, right? And then that can be good because then you can react, you can make the cold real and react to it, and have this shared experience despite the other person maybe not having the time to do that and maybe not wanting to, but still being fine with
Mm-hmm.
experiencing their character suffering from the cold elements, which I was luckily in a position where I could make something for my avatar, and I ended up doing that. So I was one of those people that was kind of prompting that from people and seeing how they react, and I would just go along with whatever they wanted to do. Some people were just totally like, I'm actually used to this. I'm like, okay, cool, but I'm freezing, so I'm gonna get my blanket, and then I kind of come back
Mm-hmm.
with that, and we're having this shared scene still. They've chosen how they want to interact with it, and I've chosen how I want to interact with it, and then we're kind of in a good, you know, we found the middle ground. We're good, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have Silver here says, "Aren't you cold? Well, let me tell you how cold it gets in my home country, and that is still shorts weather."
Yeah, this is
Yeah,
like
I think,
Canadians, right?
yeah, I think that's as like an example of a scene. Uh, I will continue my hot takes here. I am very radical in this perspective.
About
I will continue my
Canadians?
hot takes, not on Canadians, on this theoretical scenario.
Yeah.
I think like, I think I think the expectation that like the person who doesn't want to, once again, we've set the idea is that we've set the expectation in the role play that you don't have to make a model for cold weather, right? This was a clear expectation that was set. um, I think in that case it's unfair to expect that everybody who doesn't make a model for cold weather then has to come up with stuff and establish things about their character as to why they're not, why you don't have a jacket, right? I
Mm.
I think making the person like who's right, the rule is supposed to be looking out for this person, right? I think at that point, right, forcing those people to come up with stuff on their character in this role play where it's been established that you don't have to do this thing is kind of like saying, well, actually, you have to do this thing, right? Um, I think it's much more sensible to ask other people to adapt and instead kind of like ask for consent when, you know, going forward with these scenes of like, are you cold, right? I think in the same way, if you had sort of like safety and escalation mechanics, this wouldn't even be a thing that you would really have to like, you know, comment on, like I know it's like not even like this isn't even like a safety concern necessarily. It's just like, an escalation concern. I don't want to participate in this sort of scene. I don't want to have to think about, the fact that I don't have time. Like I want to have the time to put in to like
Mm.
make super cool models, but like I don't, or like I don't have the money to commission it, right? Like I don't think it's kind of like fair to make people think about that too often.
Yeah, I can see
Same
that.
thing, beach episode, somebody doesn't have a swimsuit and they jump in the pool, I think you can like make a joke about it, right? Um, that's probably fine. In the same way that like people usually make jokes about people disconnecting or whatever. Um, all of these things, all of these discrepancies from reality are only as big of a problem as you make them, right? They're only
Mhm.
as big of a problem as you make them, basically. Um, I think we do there are a lot of other things, that people are willing to kind of suspend their disbelief for. I think, somebody being in shorts and a t-shirt in the middle of winter is like on the low end of suspension of disbelief.
Right.
The sort of suspension of disbelief that we do in VR roleplay. That's on like the low end of, you know, IMO. Anyway, as I said, this is the silent hot take. This is like I am very, very radical on this on this topic.
Hmm. I think the point where I start to disagree is where it becomes like structural enough that it is like walking on eggshells. I think having the kind of escalation considerations and like your safety framework makes this incredibly easy to
Yeah,
navigate as long as you are navigating it with some level of care. Like I think the
yeah,
aren't you cold question is actually a really good ask for consent. I think that
yeah.
is intrinsically the opening to asking what it is that they want to participate in, and I think that's something that they uh, effectively have to be ready for. I don't necessarily agree that like you can't explore at least things that don't necessarily have as open of an engagement on the model work side. I think being able to react to and explore some of those things is still cool as long as it's not something that's a forced reaction. So again, like you said, the purpose of that was necessarily that people didn't have to put in the extra time in fear of being forced to have their character be cold. They can at least have a reason and they can have some level of understanding that other people around them aren't going to force them to act cold. They can at least prompt scenes that can have you reveal something about your character if you want to, or you could just, as the example initially proclaimed, just say no and then move on.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I agree with the aren't you cold question. I think that that is a good way. I will, however, once again, being in the very extreme position here, I will just put something out for your consideration, right?
Mm,
Um, because I do remember, in Gengar P, right, we had the one person who was still using uh the customizable NPC model, like almost till the very end, right? Consider instead being the one person who, despite there being a rule that you don't have to, that you don't have to, have cold weather clothes. Imagine being the one person who doesn't have the time to to put that on their model, and imagine being asked, you know, by the other 30 people in the role play all ask you, aren't you cold, like in the session, right? That's probably a bit of an exaggeration, right? But like if something kind of like becomes normalized, that you do have that like pressure, right? You do have that pressure where like eventually your role play becomes about that, right?
mm,
um and we definitely had that in a gang role play with the people who were still using the customizable NPC avatars. There was, that transition period where um they were definitely getting less engagement from others. Absolutely 100%. Eventually, when it was only down to one person, right? Once it was only down to one person, then that was what made them special, right? Like then it was like they were the one person who did it, right?
mm.
That basically became their avatar, right? But before it got to that, right? Before it got to just the one person, um, their there was kind of like if phase where definitely the people who had their custom avatars were kind of getting more engagement and more out of the role play. And I think that that same pressure situation can exist. And it seems really small. It seems really benign. I think it's something to at least think about.
Yeah.
Um, because once again, what the problem isn't asking, right? The problem isn't about whether or not you're asking the other person, "Are you cold?" Right? The problem is kind of like reminding the person that everybody else has, you know, their fancy winter coats on their model, and they've like commissioned these cool avatars, and like, you know, we and like we're updating them every week. Everybody else is doing that, and you're not.
Right.
I think
Right.
that's what I draw objection with. Not the question, "Are you cold?" Right? There's nothing wrong with the question, "Are you cold?" in itself. It's more like what it means to be on the receiving end of that question
Yeah.
repeatedly.
Okay.
And there's nothing you can do about it other than put in time that you don't have.
So I think where I settle with it then is I'm still not quite fully radicalized, but I think where I am kind of leaning is like looking at the larger sorts of shared change efforts that happen in role plays. Like, for example, everyone wearing Kevlar vests in gang roleplay, or everyone wearing a coat when it becomes winter in warp, that make people at large respond to the elements of the roleplay that change or require them to do something visibly. Uh, I think those can absolutely have these like unspoken effects, like you're saying,
Mm-hmm.
um, especially when they become kind of the norm, which it only does take one person, right? And for a lot of these things, for a lot of these like paradigmatic shifting elements, it almost always just takes one person to change it. Like the social dynamic of like a certain kind. Like we talked about this in normality, right? Like when all the elves are like, you know, doing their thing and acting their in-world existence, and then like one elf decides to be more like a person, like a modern person, and is more sensible, then suddenly the rest of the elves are assholes. Same idea with this, right? Like as soon as the one person, so I totally agree on this front, right? Like the moment the one person does the thing that is the expression of creative freedom and furthering their ability to interact with a core element of the roleplay, then suddenly everyone else feels pressure to do that too.
Mm-hmm.
And we are effectively commenting on pressure here, right?
Yep.
The only reason I am not fully radicalized here is because I also very heavily value the intrinsic value of creative expression through avatar development. I think
Oh,
it
don't
is,
worry, I do too.
yeah.
I understand.
It's like this is why I said before it's really hard to find the line here, because like you could effectively set that line at like, you know, the interaction around the winter elements, but then like if someone develops specifically to show what their character is experiencing around the winter elements, and you still have that rule, then it's like, well, everyone's still doing it, and you can't necessarily stop people from adding things to their avatars unless you really want to, in which case that hampers on the creative expression of people with their avatars. Then you do end up running into the "Are you cold?" question, uh, which then reminds the person, like you said, like they didn't put the effort into this. They didn't put that extra time, and then they feel pressure to do that. So it is just such a difficult thing to juggle,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, it is, and I fully recognize that like that creative expression is like it is definitely like the lifeblood of your roleplay, or like at least one of the really really big things, right? That is a huge draw to a lot of people.
Yep.
Um, and it is a huge draw to a lot of people. I don't think it's the main draw to everyone. And once again, it's a thing to think about, and at the very least to have clear expectations on
Mm-hmm.
like what is and isn't part of the role play, what is and isn't required. Um, because if you don't have those clear expectations, then once again, whoever is going to be putting the most work in their avatar, the person who puts in like literally hours a week tinkering on their avatar, is going to set those standards for everybody else
Right.
if you don't put those clear expectations in.
Yeah.
And like I really appreciate it. I don't want to stop those people from putting their 10 hours a week in. I want to stop those people from pressuring others into also putting 10 hours a week in,
Yeah. I'm with you on that.
That's what that's the part that I wish to stop.
I'm with you on that. Yeah. 100%. Okay. We're about 10 minutes out of our usual end time, and the interest of not delving into extra credit for our podcast.
Definitely not today.
Yeah. Are there any last things you wanted to go over before we wrap up?
Not really. I think that's all from me. I think I'd be ready to open it up for questions if there are any.
Okay, cool. Well, I also do not have anything left. So, yeah, we've gone through quite a bit here. All right. So, the field is open, as always, for questions from y'all in either the podcast channel on the Discord or in the chat while we wrap up here. But we're going to go ahead and wrap up.
We have exactly 9 minutes and 15 seconds.
13, 12, 11. Anyways. So this has been the On the Couch podcast. This is the last episode of the On the Couch podcast. We created this podcast to talk over each of the core principles of the Couchform school of thought. I'm going to go ahead and write it right there. That Google Doc is the core principles, and the Discord is where the principles and further discussion live. We created this podcast, again, to go over the 12 principles, and we are now at number 12. This is the end of the On the Couch podcast. How does that feel, Selin?
Wow, we did it. It's done.
Yeah, we it does not feel like it's been 3 months since we started.
It's been more than 3 months since we started.
Austria, yeah, we did skip a week or two, right?
Yeah.
God. As we sit upon this tower of couches, these extra credit couches, feeling the brisk wind up here above the height of that mountain in the background.
I'm gonna send you a thing. I don't know. I don't know if you're...
Oh, what's this? Do we wanna? Oh, is this the soft end?
Yeah, the soft end. Yeah.
Okay, let me see if I can put this in
the
time.
the only good type of soft end.
Okay, I'm gonna open this up. Or is this gonna be floating? It's gonna be floating. It's gonna be big when I put this up here. Oh.
It's also a PNG, so it's just. Oh.
There. There's our soft end. Yeah, nice soft pillow down there. Perfect.
Oh, Silver actually has a question. Any future ideas for podcasts on general VR roleplay design? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't mind if we ever thought of any more topics to discuss. I wouldn't mind coming back to this. Probably not for a while, I think. And there are no current plans. At least I'm not aware of any. I don't think... I don't know. I don't know if you thought of anything.
I haven't. These podcasts have been very involved discussions, and we've basically cooked on as much as we could for putting together Couchform in its entirety. So I think this is fine for now. I will say
for now.
I have passed around some ideas in my head and with other people on like talk show like things that I'd want to do, like the roleplay review idea. That one's like an up in the air one that I have where I could like invite some people on to like talk through what their session was like and comment on things that happened and ways that things could have gone. I kind of still want to do that, but it's something that I would run myself. is the way I've currently thought about it, and I also don't know if I want to run it yet. So this is up in the air, but it's been cooking in my brain for a while now. It's been like maybe a couple months, kind of
Yeah,
simmering in there, you know.
yeah, I certainly wouldn't mind doing more roleplay talking because that's I kind of enjoy doing that thing. But no plans right now, and probably not for a while. And if it would be, it would probably be on some other topic because we're done with the Couchform principles. So yeah, it's over. That's basically it.
Whew. This has been wild. I'm just glad I having like sent this out in the world, just this, you know, solidified principled school of thought. Certainly not a huge amount of people have really commented on it, I will say. But those that have like really latched onto some of the ideas,
Mhm.
have really kind of taken value in some of them, have like taken inspiration, created things based off of it, changed the way they've run things, etc. And I think it's really cool to see people invested in, you know, taking a second look at the things that they've done and like seeing it from a more principled perspective where they can like understand what it is that they're involving in and like how that affects the way that they experience their uh, projects, how they build them, how other people experience them.
Mhm.
Because like in the end, like that's what we're playing. That's what we plan to do with this, right? It is not only to talk about what we think is essential, not only to talk about what we want to experience within our style of roleplay, but also to get other people talking about it and to take inspiration from it and to think, you know, what is my style? What is it that I want? Because like we're like, for example, we're against like game mechanics, right? But like maybe someone else is like, I actually enjoy that. I think that's a really interesting and fun part of something that I want to experience. And we have someone like that in the Myriad server that like came in just recently to talk about how much they enjoy when things are really like structured and mechanical and gamified. And they have built like a full role play off of that sort of idea. And I love that discussion because they're able to say, you know, I love this. I built something with this, and this is what I enjoy. This is my style. I'm like, you know, more power to you. Like you've put in the thought, you put in the brain power. You know what you like. Like roleplay is about having fun and having fun with others and collaborating with others. So like knowing how you have fun is one of the most important things, and I would
Mhm.
say the most important first step to experiencing roleplay.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Pretty much. And you know, worst comes to worst, right? Like that definitely. You just mentioned that not a lot of people have necessarily engaged with this, but worst comes to worst, in a couple of years' time, we can kind of look back on this and eat our own words. That's always the best experience. That's why you write those manifestos. That's why you kind of put out this information, kind of put it down in writing, or in this case, in podcast form, so you can look back on it and kind of see how far how far you've come. Um,
Oh yeah. You'll just like look back and
we
think,
have
man,
2 minutes.
I was a fucking moron. Why did I think I liked that? And you know,
Yeah, I know.
we change a lot. I if I had looked 2 years earlier, even a year earlier, like if I looked at how I was when I first started Warp and what I enjoy about roleplay now, vastly different, vastly different. And I think a lot of that came down to me understanding and realizing what I actually liked, rather than just like thinking at a very surface level about it and just kind of accepting whatever I experienced at face value. So yeah, anything else before we sign off?
No, I think that's it.
Okay. Well, thank you all for taking part in this journey with us. Thank you, Dylan, for the immense work and tireless efforts that you have put into all of this with me to make this a reality. It's been wonderful having you along for the ride.
All right. Well, have a good night, day, whatever time it is when you're watching this. Bye.
Yeah, and if you all have a 3-day weekend, enjoy tomorrow. But if you don't,
Yep.
that sucks. Anyways. All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care and
Bye.
goodbye.